The emergence of Celtic civilization represents one of Europe's most significant cultural transformations, arising from the complex archaeological record of Central Europe during the late Bronze Age transition into the early Iron Age. The roots of Celtic identity can be traced through two distinct but interconnected archaeological cultures, the Urnfield culture and the subsequent Hallstatt culture, both of which provide compelling evidence for the gradual formation of what scholars recognize as Proto-Celtic peoples. The Urnfield culture, named after its distinctive cremation burial practices, dominated vast swathes of Central Europe from the Upper Danube Valley through modern-day Austria, southern Germany, eastern France, and parts of Switzerland. Archaeological excavations across these regions have revealed a remarkably uniform material culture characterized by sophisticated bronze-working techniques, standardized pottery forms, and most notably the practice of cremating the dead and placing their ashes in ceramic urns within large cemetery fields. These urn fields, some containing thousands of burials, demonstrate not only advanced metallurgical skills, but also complex social organization capable of managing extensive burial grounds over centuries. The transition from bronze to iron technology marks a crucial turning point in Proto-Celtic development. Archaeological evidence from sites like Hallstatt in Austria reveals that by 800 BCE, Central European communities had mastered iron production, creating tools and weapons of superior quality to their bronze predecessors. The famous salt mines at Hallstatt, which gave their name to the entire cultural period, provided the economic foundation for this technological advancement. Salt extraction required sophisticated engineering, including wooden mining galleries preserved in the anaerobic conditions deep underground, and the wealth generated from salt trade enabled communities to invest in ironworking infrastructure and acquire raw materials from distant sources. The Hallstatt culture represents the full flowering of early Celtic civilization, with archaeological sites across Central Europe revealing increasingly sophisticated material culture. Excavations at Hünberg in southwestern Germany have uncovered a fortified settlement with Mediterranean-influenced architecture, including mud brick walls constructed using techniques learned from Greek colonists. The site's rich assemblages include imported Greek pottery, Etruscan bronze vessels, and locally produced goods of exceptional quality, indicating extensive trade networks stretching from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Celtic ironworking techniques developed distinct characteristics that set them apart from contemporary cultures. Archaeological analysis of iron artifacts from Hallstatt period sites reveals sophisticated understanding of carbon content manipulation, quenching techniques, and pattern welding. Celtic smiths produced not only functional tools and weapons, but also decorative items featuring intricate geometric patterns that would later evolve into the distinctive Latine artistic style. The quality of Celtic ironwork is evidenced by finds such as the Gundestrup cauldron and numerous ceremonial weapons discovered in ritual deposits across Europe. Pottery production during this period underwent significant stylistic evolution, with early Hallstatt ceramics displaying geometric decorations executed with precision and consistency across wide geographical areas. The standardization of pottery forms suggests established trade relationships and possibly shared cultural practices among Proto-Celtic communities. Distinctive vessel types, including large storage jars, drinking cups, and ceremonial bowls, appear consistently from eastern France to western Hungary, indicating cultural unity despite geographical separation. Burial practices provide particularly rich evidence for early Celtic social development. The transition from Urnfield cremation practices to increasingly elaborate inhumation burials during the Hallstatt period reflects significant social changes. Early Hallstatt burials maintained the cremation tradition, but gradually incorporated more grave goods, including iron weapons, bronze ornaments, and imported luxury items. By the later Hallstatt period, wealthy individuals were buried in wooden chambers beneath large earthen mounds, surrounded by wagons, horse gear, and extensive assemblages of prestige goods. The famous Hochdorf burial near Stuttgart exemplifies the wealth and sophistication of early Celtic elite culture. Dating to approximately 530 BCE, this burial contained a 40-year-old man laid on a bronze couch, wearing gold ornaments and surrounded by a four-wheeled wagon, bronze vessels, and drinking equipment capable of serving 9 people. The burial chamber itself was constructed from massive oak timbers and covered with stones and earth to form a mound 60 meters in diameter. Such elaborate burials required enormous community resources and demonstrate the emergence of a powerful aristocratic class. The linguistic development of Celtic languages during this period remains partially reconstructed through comparative analysis of later Celtic languages and place name evidence. Proto-Celtic likely emerged in the Central European regions, where Urnfield and Hallstatt cultures flourished, gradually spreading outward through migration, trade, and cultural diffusion. The Celtic language family eventually encompassed Gaulish in modern France, Celtiberian in Spain, Lepontic in northern Italy, and the insular Celtic languages of Britain and Ireland. Archaeological evidence suggests that Celtic linguistic expansion accompanied technological and cultural diffusion rather than massive population movements. The spread of Celtic place names across Europe, many relating to geographical features, settlements, and tribal territories, indicates gradual linguistic adoption by existing populations rather than wholesale replacement. River names like the Rhine, Danube, and Thames preserve Celtic linguistic elements, suggesting the profound impact of Celtic culture on European geography and identity. Social stratification became increasingly pronounced during the Hallstatt period, with archaeological evidence revealing clear distinctions between elite and common burials. Wealthy graves contain imported Mediterranean goods, fine metalwork, and symbols of authority such as ceremonial weapons and drinking vessels. Common burials, while still containing grave goods, lack the elaborate assemblages and monumental construction associated with elite interments. This stratification suggests the development of hereditary aristocracy supported by control over trade, specialized craft production, and agricultural surplus. The warrior culture that would become synonymous with Celtic identity emerged during this formative period. Archaeological evidence from Hallstatt sites reveals sophisticated weapons technology, including long iron swords, spearheads, and defensive equipment. The emphasis on martial display is evident in both burial assemblages and settlement contexts, where weapons appear not only as functional items, but as symbols of status and identity. Warrior burials often include complete weapon sets, horse gear, and ceremonial drinking equipment, suggesting the integration of martial prowess with social authority and ritual practice. Trade networks during the Hallstatt period extended across vast distances, connecting Celtic communities with Mediterranean civilizations, Baltic amber sources, and Atlantic tin deposits. Archaeological evidence from sites like Montlassoy in Burgundy reveals direct contact with Greek traders who established relationships with Celtic elites for the exchange of luxury goods. The famous Vix burial, discovered near Montlassoy, contained the largest known Greek bronze vessel, a crater, standing 1.64 m tall and weighing over 200 kilograms, alongside Greek and Etruscan imports and locally produced Celtic masterworks. The development of fortified settlements, known as oppidi in later periods, began during the late Hallstatt era. These hilltop sites, protected by elaborate earthworks and wooden palisades, served as centers for craft production, trade, and political authority. Excavations at sites like the Hohenberg have revealed specialized workshops for metalworking, pottery production, and textile manufacture, indicating the concentration of skilled craftsmen under elite patronage. The defensive nature of these settlements suggests increasing competition between communities and the need to protect accumulated wealth and resources. Craft specialization reached new levels of sophistication during this period, with archaeological evidence revealing distinct workshops for different trades. Bronzeworking continued alongside iron production, with Celtic craftsmen creating elaborate decorative items, including torques, brooches, and ceremonial vessels. The technical skill required for these productions indicates extensive apprenticeship systems and the transmission of specialized knowledge across generations. Amberworking, glass bead production, and fine pottery manufacture all show evidence of professional specialization and quality control. The religious and ritual aspects of early Celtic culture, while difficult to reconstruct from archaeological evidence alone, show distinctive patterns that would persist throughout Celtic history. Ritual deposits of weapons, ornaments, and other valuable items in water sources, caves, and other natural features suggest sophisticated belief systems centered on the sacredness of the natural world. The practice of depositing complete weapon sets in rivers and lakes indicates rituals involving the deliberate sacrifice of valuable items, possibly related to warfare, seasonal cycles, or rites of passage. The transformation from Hallstatt to Latin culture around 450 BCE marked a revolutionary shift in Celtic artistic expression and territorial ambition that would define European civilization for the next 4 centuries. Named after the archaeological site on Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, where hundreds of Celtic artifacts were discovered in the 19th century, the Latin period witnessed the emergence of a distinctive artistic style that synthesized indigenous Celtic traditions with Mediterranean influences to create something entirely unprecedented in European material culture. The Latin artistic revolution began in the workshops of skilled metalworkers who had inherited centuries of Celtic craftsmanship, but now encountered new inspirations through intensified contact with Greek and Etruscan traders. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Celtic heartland reveals a dramatic departure from the geometric patterns and rigid symmetry characteristic of Hallstatt art. Instead, Latin artisans developed a fluid, organic style featuring curvilinear designs, stylized animal motifs, and complex interlacing patterns that seem to flow across the surfaces of bronze mirrors, sword scabbards, and ceremonial shields. The technical mastery required for Latin metalwork exceeded anything previously achieved in temperate Europe. Craftsmen working in bronze, iron, and precious metals developed sophisticated techniques including repoussé work, where designs were hammered from the reverse side to create raised relief patterns, and intricate inlay work using coral, amber, and enamel. The famous Battersea shield, recovered from the Thames and dating to approximately 350 BCE, exemplifies this technical achievement with its flowing bronze designs, enhanced by red enamel inlays that create a mesmerizing interplay of curves and spirals across the shield surface. Celtic torques, the distinctive neck rings that became symbols of aristocratic status, reached new heights of sophistication during the Latin period. The Snettersham Great Torque, discovered in Norfolk and crafted around 75 BCE, demonstrates the extraordinary skill of Celtic goldsmiths who twisted 8 separate gold cables together to form a neck ring weighing over 1 kilogram. The torque's terminals feature intricate relief work depicting stylized faces and flowing patterns that required hundreds of hours of meticulous craftsmanship. Such pieces were not merely ornamental, but served as displays of wealth, technical mastery, and cultural identity that could be read and understood across the Celtic world. The development of Latin sword technology represented a parallel revolution in military equipment. Celtic swordsmiths perfected the production of long iron swords, typically measuring 60 to 80 centimeters in blade length, that became the preferred weapons of Celtic warriors throughout Europe. These swords featured carefully controlled carbon content that provided optimal balance between hardness and flexibility, with some examples showing evidence of pattern welding techniques that created distinctive watered steel effects along the blade surface. The elaborate scabbards protecting these weapons became canvases for Latin artistic expression, featuring engraved and embossed designs that often incorporated mythological themes and zoomorphic motifs. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites reveals the sophisticated organization of Latin craft production. Excavations at Mosching in Bavaria have uncovered specialized metalworking areas where different craftsmen focused on specific aspects of production, from initial smelting and forging to final decoration and finishing. The standardization of certain decorative motifs across vast geographical distances suggests the existence of established artistic traditions transmitted through apprenticeship networks and maintained through regular contact between craftsmen from different regions. The ceramic tradition during the Latin period underwent its own transformation, with potters developing new forms and decorative techniques that complemented the artistic revolution in metalwork. Graphite-tempered pottery, particularly common in the eastern Celtic regions, achieved a distinctive lustrous black finish that provided an elegant backdrop for incised geometric patterns. Storage vessels, drinking cups, and ceremonial bowls displayed increasingly sophisticated proportions and surface treatments that reflected the same aesthetic principles governing metalwork design. The territorial expansion of Celtic peoples during the Latin period represents one of the most significant population movements in European prehistory. Archaeological evidence combined with historical accounts from Greek and Roman sources documents Celtic migrations that carried Latin culture from its Central European origins to the Atlantic shores of Ireland and the highlands of Anatolia. These movements were not simple military conquests, but complex processes involving trade relationships, intermarriage, cultural adoption, and gradual settlement that transformed the ethnic and linguistic landscape of Europe. The Celtic expansion into Gaul began in the 5th century BCE as communities from the Rhine Valley and eastern France gradually moved westward and southward. Archaeological evidence from sites like Bibracht on Mont Bivray shows the establishment of major Celtic settlements that controlled important trade routes and served as centers for craft production and political authority. The Gauls, as these Western Celts became known to Roman writers, developed a sophisticated tribal confederation system that enabled them to coordinate military campaigns, regulate trade, and maintain cultural unity across vast territories. Celtic penetration into the Iberian Peninsula followed both overland routes through the Pyrenees and maritime connections along the Atlantic coast. The Celt-Iberians, who occupied much of central and northern Spain, created a distinctive culture that blended Celtic traditions with indigenous Iberian elements. Archaeological sites like Numantia reveal fortified settlements with characteristic Celtic defensive works, Latin-style metalwork, and evidence of warrior culture. while also showing adaptation to local conditions and interaction with Mediterranean trading partners. The Celtic colonization of Britain and Ireland represents perhaps the most successful and enduring aspect of Latin expansion. Archaeological evidence suggests multiple waves of Celtic settlement beginning around 500 BCE, with different groups establishing themselves in various regions of the British Isles. The Hallstatt and early Latin material culture, found at sites like Danebury in Hampshire, indicates that Celtic settlers brought with them not only their artistic traditions and technological knowledge, but also their social organization and religious practices. In Ireland, the Celtic settlement appears to have been particularly thorough, with archaeological evidence showing the rapid adoption of Latin material culture and the establishment of characteristic Celtic social structures. The famous Bruder hoard, discovered in County Londonderry, contains gold objects including a model boat and elaborate torques that demonstrate the successful transplantation of Celtic gold working traditions to Irish soil. The linguistic evidence supports this archaeological picture, as Irish Gaelic preserves archaic Celtic features that suggest continuous development from early Latin period settlement. The most dramatic episode of Celtic expansion involved the migrations into Italy and beyond during the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE. Historical sources describe Celtic armies crossing the Alps and establishing settlements throughout the Po Valley, bringing them into direct conflict with expanding Roman power. Archaeological evidence from sites like Monte Bible, near Bologna, reveals Celtic settlements with characteristic Latin material culture, including weapons, ornaments, and pottery that demonstrate the successful establishment of Celtic communities in northern Italy. The Celtic invasion of central Italy culminated in the sack of Rome in 387 BCE, an event that traumatized Roman consciousness and influenced their subsequent attitudes toward Celtic peoples. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the establishment of Celtic settlements throughout central Italy, with sites yielding typical Latin artifacts, including long swords, shield bosses, and ornamental metalwork. The Celts who settled in Italy, known as Cisalpine Gauls, maintained their cultural identity while adapting to Mediterranean conditions and engaging in complex relationships with Roman and Etruscan neighbors. Even more remarkable was the Celtic expansion into Asia Minor, where groups known as Galatians established settlements in central Anatolia during the 3rd century BCE. These Celtic migrants, invited as mercenaries by Hellenistic rulers, eventually carved out their own territories and maintained Celtic language and culture for centuries. Archaeological evidence from Galatian sites includes Latin-style metalwork and pottery that demonstrates the remarkable persistence of Celtic cultural traditions, even in distant Asian contexts. The development of Upper represents the culmination of Celtic urbanization and political organization during the Latin period. These fortified settlements, typically located on elevated terrain and protected by massive earthworks and timber palisades, served as centers of political authority, craft production, and long-distance trade. The oppidum at Mosching in Bavaria covered over 380 hectares and housed an estimated population of 5,000 to 10,000 people, making it one of the largest settlements in temperate Europe during the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. Archaeological excavations at Major Upper reveal sophisticated internal organization with designated areas for different activities. At Bibracht, the Gaelic capital of the Aedui tribe, archaeologists have identified distinct quarters for metalworking, pottery production, and residential areas, along with evidence of planned street layouts and centralized water management systems. The scale and complexity of these settlements required coordinated planning and substantial labor investment that could only be achieved through effective political organization and economic surplus. The defensive systems protecting Upper demonstrate advanced military engineering that drew upon centuries of Celtic fortification experience. The characteristic Murus Gallicus construction technique, described by Julius Caesar during his Gallic campaigns, involved timber framework filled with stone and earth that created walls both flexible enough to absorb impact and strong enough to resist siege warfare. Archaeological investigation of these fortifications reveals sophisticated understanding of defensive principles, with multiple lines of walls, elaborate gate systems, and carefully planned approaches that maximize defensive advantages. Trade networks during the Latinum period reached unprecedented complexity and geographical extent, connecting Celtic communities with partners throughout Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond. Archaeological evidence from Upper reveals the presence of goods from distant sources: amber from the Baltic, silk from China, wine and foray from Italy, and exotic materials like coral and ivory that required extensive trading relationships to obtain. The standardization of certain artifact types across vast distances suggests established trade routes and possibly formal commercial agreements between different Celtic communities. The relationship between Celtic peoples and Mediterranean civilizations during the Latine period involved complex cultural exchange that influenced both partners. Greek and Etruscan traders established permanent relationships with Celtic elites, exchanging luxury goods for raw materials, slaves, and Celtic manufactured products. Archaeological evidence from sites like Vix and Hockdorf shows that Celtic aristocrats acquired not only Mediterranean goods, but also adopted certain Mediterranean customs, including wine-drinking ceremonies and banqueting practices that became integrated into Celtic social ritual. Celtic communities also served as intermediaries in long-distance trade networks, facilitating the movement of goods between northern European sources and Mediterranean markets. The famous amber route, connecting Baltic amber deposits with Mediterranean consumers, passed through Celtic territory and provided Celtic middlemen with opportunities to profit from trans-European commerce. Archaeological evidence suggests that Celtic traders developed sophisticated understanding of market demands and quality standards that enabled them to compete effectively with established Mediterranean trading networks. The technological innovations of the Latine period extended beyond artistic and military applications to include advances in agriculture, transportation, and industrial production. Celtic farmers developed improved plowing techniques, using iron-tip plows that enabled more efficient cultivation of heavy soils, while advances in metalworking technology supported increased production of agricultural tools and weapons. The development of rotary querns for grain processing and improved pottery kilns for ceramic production demonstrates the breadth of Celtic technological achievement during this period. Transportation technology also advanced significantly, with Celtic craftsmen producing sophisticated wheeled vehicles adapted to different purposes and terrain conditions. Archaeological evidence includes remains of both two-wheeled and four-wheeled vehicles, some elaborately decorated for ceremonial use and others designed for practical transportation and warfare. The technical skill required for wheel construction, axle fitting, and vehicle suspension systems indicates specialized knowledge and established manufacturing traditions that supported both local needs and long-distance trade. The social implications of Latine period developments were profound, with archaeological evidence revealing increasing social stratification and the emergence of powerful aristocratic classes that controlled both political authority and economic resources. Elite burials from this period contain unprecedented assemblages of luxury goods, weapons, and symbols of authority that demonstrate the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of warrior aristocrats. The famous Werner burial in Switzerland contained over 40 bronze vessels, gold ornaments, and a complete warrior's equipment that required the resources of entire communities to assemble. The intricate social fabric of Celtic civilization rested upon a sophisticated hierarchical system that governed every aspect of daily existence, from the sacred rituals performed in moonlit groves to the mundane transactions conducted in bustling marketplace settlements. Archaeological evidence combined with accounts from classical authors reveals a society far more complex than the barbarian stereotype propagated by Roman writers, displaying instead a nuanced social order that balanced individual achievement with collective responsibility, spiritual authority with temporal power, and local autonomy with broader cultural unity. At the apex of Celtic social structure stood the Druids, a priestly class whose influence permeated every level of society and whose authority extended far beyond religious matters into legal, educational, and political spheres. These learned men, for the Druidical orders appear to have been exclusively male according to classical sources, underwent extensive training that could last up to 20 years, during which they memorized vast quantities of oral tradition, including laws, genealogies, astronomical calculations, and sacred law. The Druids' power derived not from hereditary privilege, but from their mastery of knowledge that was considered essential for the proper functioning of Celtic society. The educational system controlled by the Druids represented one of the most sophisticated intellectual traditions in prehistoric Europe. Young men from aristocratic families traveled considerable distances to study under renowned Druids, learning not only religious doctrine but also practical skills including medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and jurisprudence. The Druidical schools, often located in sacred groves or near important religious sites, attracted students from across the Celtic world, creating networks of shared knowledge and cultural exchange that helped maintain Celtic unity despite political fragmentation. Druids served as the primary arbiters of legal disputes, a role that required intimate knowledge of customary law and precedent that had been transmitted orally for generations. Their legal authority extended from minor property disputes between neighbors to major conflicts between tribes, and their decisions were considered binding because they were believed to reflect divine will rather than merely human judgment. The Druids' legal pronouncements were enforced through religious sanctions, including the threat of exclusion from sacrificial rituals, which effectively meant social death in Celtic society. The astronomical knowledge possessed by Druids enabled them to maintain complex calendar systems that regulated both religious observances and agricultural activities. Archaeological evidence from sites like Stonehenge and Newgrange suggests that Celtic Druids inherited and developed sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles that allowed them to predict eclipses, determine optimal planting times, and coordinate seasonal festivals across wide geographical areas. This astronomical expertise reinforced their religious authority while providing practical benefits that enhanced agricultural productivity and social coordination. The warrior aristocracy formed the second tier of Celtic social hierarchy, comprising professional fighters whose martial prowess provided both military leadership and political authority within their communities. These warriors, known by various terms including equities in Gaul and Flaith in Ireland, maintained their status through constant demonstration of courage, skill, and generosity that earned them the loyalty of followers and the respect of peers. Unlike the Druids, whose authority derived from knowledge, the warrior elite based their power on personal achievement in battle and the ability to attract and maintain armed retinues. Celtic warriors followed elaborate codes of conduct that emphasized honor, bravery, and loyalty above mere survival or material gain. Archaeological evidence from warrior burials reveals the central importance of weapons and martial equipment in defining aristocratic identity, with swords, spears, shields, and horse gear receiving the same careful craftsmanship and artistic attention as religious objects or royal regalia. The quality and decoration of a warrior's equipment served as visible indicators of his status and achievements, while the ritual deposition of weapons in lakes and rivers suggests that martial prowess was considered a gift from the gods that required appropriate acknowledgement. The institution of the warband or comitatus, as described by classical authors, provided the organizational foundation for Celtic military and political power. Young warriors attached themselves to established leaders, swearing oaths of loyalty that bound them to fight alongside their chosen chief until death. In return, successful war leaders provided their followers with weapons, armor, horses, and opportunities for glory and plunder that could establish their own independent status. This system created networks of personal loyalty that transcended tribal boundaries and enabled the formation of large military coalitions when circumstances required. Celtic warrior culture emphasized individual combat and personal display that often appeared reckless to more disciplined opponents, but served important social functions within Celtic society. The practice of single combat before major battles allowed warriors to demonstrate their courage and skill while potentially resolving conflicts without massive casualties. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Celtic weapons were designed as much for display as for practical use, with elaborate decorations and precious metal inlays that proclaimed their owner's status and achievements. The third major social category encompassed the free commoners who formed the backbone of Celtic economic and social life. This diverse group included farmers, craftsmen, traders, and other specialists who possessed personal freedom and property rights, but lacked the specialized knowledge of druids or the martial achievements of warriors. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites reveals that free commoners lived in substantial houses, owned livestock and agricultural tools, and participated in local and trade networks that connected them to the broader Celtic world. Celtic farmers developed sophisticated agricultural techniques adapted to diverse environmental conditions across Europe. Archaeological evidence from sites like Biskupin in Poland reveals advanced understanding of crop rotation, selective breeding of livestock, and soil management that supported dense populations and generated agricultural surpluses necessary for craft specialization and trade. The Celtic plough, with its iron share and moldboard design, enabled cultivation of heavy clay soils that had previously been unsuitable for agriculture, expanding the area available for farming and supporting population growth. Livestock management formed a crucial component of Celtic agriculture, with cattle serving as the primary measure of wealth and social status throughout the Celtic world. Archaeological analysis of animal bones from Celtic sites reveals sophisticated breeding programs that produced larger, more productive animals than their wild predecessors. Cattle provided not only meat and milk but also leather, bone tools, and traction power for plowing and transportation. The importance of cattle in Celtic society is reflected in early Irish law codes that established detailed regulations for cattle loans, grazing rights, and compensation for stolen or injured animals. Celtic metalworkers achieved technical mastery that rivaled the best craftsmen of the Mediterranean world, developing innovative techniques for iron production, bronze casting, and precious metalworking that enabled them to create both functional tools and artistic masterpieces. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites reveals sophisticated understanding of metallurgical processes, including controlled atmospheres for smelting, quenching techniques for hardening iron, and complex alloy compositions for specialized applications. The standardization of certain tool types across vast geographical distances suggests established training methods and quality control systems that maintained consistent standards. The organization of craft production in Celtic society involved both independent specialists and workshop groups attached to aristocratic households or religious centers. Archaeological excavations at sites like Moshing have revealed specialized quarters where different craftsmen focused on particular aspects of production, from initial metalworking to final decoration and finishing. The concentration of exotic raw materials and finished goods at these sites indicates that craft production was closely linked to long-distance trade networks and elite patronage systems. Celtic religious belief centered on the fundamental interconnection between the natural world and the spiritual realm, with sacred sites located at springs, groves, caves, and other natural features that were believed to provide access to divine power. Archaeological evidence reveals that Celts practiced elaborate rituals involving the deposition of valuable objects in water sources, with thousands of weapons, ornaments, and other artifacts recovered from rivers and lakes across Europe. These ritual deposits represent deliberate sacrifices of valuable items that served to maintain proper relationships between human communities and the supernatural forces that controlled natural phenomena. The sacred groves that served as centers for druidical worship and instruction were carefully maintained forest areas where ancient trees provided natural temples for religious ceremonies. Classical authors describe these groves as places of awesome power where druids conducted human sacrifices and other rituals too sacred for outsiders to witness. Archaeological evidence for grove sanctuaries is limited due to the perishable nature of wooden structures, but pollen analysis and other environmental data suggest that certain forest areas were indeed managed as sacred spaces for extended periods. Water held particular significance in Celtic religious practice, with springs, rivers, and lakes serving as gateways to the other world where gods and spirits resided. The ritual deposition of objects in water sources appears to have served multiple functions, including thanksgiving offerings for successful harvests or military victories, requests for divine assistance in times of crisis, and ceremonies marking important transitions in individual or community life. The careful selection of objects for water deposits suggests that these rituals followed established protocols that specified appropriate offerings for different circumstances. Celtic religious festivals followed seasonal cycles that coordinated agricultural activities with spiritual observances, creating a calendar system that integrated practical and sacred concerns. The four major festivals of Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad marked crucial transitions in the agricultural year, while providing opportunities for communities to gather for religious ceremonies, legal proceedings, and social activities. Archaeological evidence from festival sites reveals temporary structures and activity areas that accommodated large gatherings, suggesting that these celebrations drew participants from wide geographical areas. The role of women in Celtic society appears to have been more prominent than in many contemporary civilizations, with archaeological and literary evidence indicating that women could own property, initiate divorce proceedings, and in some cases exercise political authority. Classical authors describe Celtic women as physically powerful and politically influential, participating in warfare and serving as advisors to male leaders. Archaeological evidence from female burials reveals that some women were buried with weapons and symbols of authority, suggesting that gender roles in Celtic society were more flexible than rigid, patriarchal systems found elsewhere. Celtic marriage customs involved complex negotiations between families that considered economic, political, and social factors in addition to personal preferences. Archaeological evidence suggests that marriage alliances served to cement relationships between different tribal groups and facilitate trade and military cooperation. The practice of bride price and dowry exchange created reciprocal obligations that extended beyond the married couple to encompass their entire kinship networks, strengthening social bonds and reducing the likelihood of conflict between related groups. Legal systems in Celtic society operated through assemblies of free men who gathered at regular intervals to hear disputes, witness contracts, and make decisions affecting their communities. These assemblies, often held at traditional meeting places marked by stone circles or other monuments, provided forums for democratic participation in local governance, while maintaining respect for customary law and druidical authority. Archaeological evidence from assembly sites reveals permanent structures and activity areas that accommodated large gatherings, suggesting that legal proceedings were important social events that drew participants from across tribal territories. The Celtic concept of honor permeated all aspects of social interaction, creating behavioral expectations that governed relationships between individuals of different social ranks. Honor could be gained through martial achievement, generous hospitality, skillful craftsmanship, or wise counsel, while it could be lost through cowardice, stinginess, poor workmanship, or false testimony. The maintenance of personal family honor required constant attention to social obligations and public behavior, creating a system of social control that operated through peer pressure rather than centralized authority. Celtic households typically included extended family members, servants, and dependent clients who formed economic and social units capable of self-sufficiency in most circumstances. Archaeological evidence from domestic sites reveals substantial houses with multiple rooms and storage areas that accommodated large household groups and their possessions. The organization of domestic space suggests clear distinctions between public and private areas, with specialized spaces for different activities including food preparation, craft production, and religious observances. The economic foundation of Celtic society rested on mixed farming systems that combined crop cultivation with animal husbandry, supplemented by hunting, fishing, and gathering of wild resources. Archaeological analysis of settlement sites reveals sophisticated understanding of environmental management, with evidence of forest clearance, field systems, and water management that maximized agricultural productivity while maintaining ecological balance. The diversity of economic activities within Celtic communities provided resilience against environmental fluctuations and created opportunities for specialization and trade. The collision between Celtic civilization and Roman imperial ambition reached its decisive moment in 58 BCE, when Gaius Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon of his political career by accepting the proconsulship of Gaul. What began as a routine administrative appointment to govern the relatively peaceful Roman provinces of Cisalpine Gaul and Narbonese Gaul would transform into the most systematic and devastating military campaign in Celtic history, ultimately destroying the independence of dozens of tribes and reshaping the political landscape of Western Europe forever. Caesar's initial justification for military intervention came from the migration of the Helvetii, a Celtic tribe occupying modern Switzerland who had decided to abandon their mountainous homeland for more fertile territories in western Gaul. The Helvetii had spent 3 years preparing for this mass migration, burning their settlements and accumulating supplies for the journey of their entire population, estimated by Caesar at 368,000 people, including 92,000 warriors. Archaeological evidence from sites like Latina itself reveals the thoroughness of this preparation. with hordes of coins and valuables buried by families who expected to return but never did. The Helvetii migration posed a strategic threat to Roman interests that extended far beyond the immediate disruption of tribal boundaries. Their planned route would take them through the territory of the Sequani and Aedui, two Gallic tribes that had maintained friendly relations with Rome and served as buffers against more hostile northern tribes. Caesar recognized that allowing such a massive population movement would destabilize the entire region and potentially create a power vacuum that could be filled by Germanic tribes from across the Rhine, a prospect that Roman strategic thinking found unacceptable. Caesar's response demonstrated the methodical approach that would characterize his entire Gallic campaign. Rather than simply blocking the Helvetii migration, he mobilized 4 legions and moved rapidly to intercept the tribe at the Saona River, where they were attempting to cross into Aedui territory. The Roman attack caught the Helvetii in a vulnerable position, with only a quarter of their number having completed the river crossing, resulting in a massacre that eliminated the Tigurini, one of the 4 Helvetii subtribes, as an effective fighting force. The subsequent pursuit of the main Helvetii force revealed Caesar's tactical brilliance and his understanding of Celtic warfare. The Helvetii, burdened by their massive wagon train and non-combatant population, could not match the mobility of Roman legions that had shed all unnecessary equipment and supplies. Caesar's forces harassed the Celtic column for weeks, cutting off foraging parties and preventing the Helvetii from establishing defensive positions, while gradually wearing down their morale and supplies. The decisive confrontation occurred at Bibracta, the fortified capital of the Aedui tribe, where the desperate Helvetii turned to face their Roman pursuers in a battle that would demonstrate both the strengths and fatal weaknesses of Celtic military organization. The Helvetii deployed their warriors in the traditional Celtic formation, with their best fighters in the front ranks and their wagon train positioned behind the battle line to provide both protection for non-combatants and motivation for the warriors who knew their families depended on victory. The initial Celtic assault followed time-honored tactics that had served Celtic warriors for centuries. The Helvetii advanced in dense formations, their warriors shouting war cries and clashing weapons against shields to intimidate their enemies and build their own courage. Their long swords and spears gave them reach advantages in individual combat, while their round shields provided protection against missile weapons. The ferocity of the Celtic charge initially pushed back the Roman front lines, creating moments of crisis that tested the discipline and training of Caesar's legions. However, the Roman tactical system proved superior to Celtic methods in sustained combat. The Roman manipular formation allowed for flexible response to changing battlefield conditions, with fresh troops moving forward to replace exhausted fighters while maintaining formation integrity. The Roman gladius, shorter than Celtic swords but designed for thrusting rather than slashing, proved more effective in close-quarters combat, where the longer Celtic weapons became unwieldy. Most critically, Roman tactical doctrine emphasized coordinated unit action rather than individual heroics, preventing the kind of battlefield fragmentation that often occurred when Celtic warriors pursued personal glory. The battle's turning point came when Caesar committed his reserves in a flanking maneuver that caught the Helvetii warriors between 2 Roman forces. The Celtic formation, designed for frontal assault, could not adapt quickly enough to this tactical innovation. As their battle line collapsed, panic spread through the Helvetii ranks, and what had begun as an organized withdrawal became a rout. The Celtic warriors, many of whom had never faced Roman legions in pitched battle, discovered that their traditional tactics were inadequate against opponents who fought as disciplined units rather than individual champions. The aftermath of Bibracte revealed the devastating effectiveness of Roman military organization. Caesar's forces captured the Helvetii wagon train intact, along with detailed records written in Greek letters that provided intelligence about Celtic tribal organization, population figures, and military capabilities. These documents, which Caesar mentions in his commentaries, gave the Romans unprecedented insight into Celtic society and enabled them to plan future campaigns with detailed knowledge of their opponent's strengths and weaknesses. The surviving Helvetii, reduced to perhaps 110,000 from their original number, were forced to return to their homeland under Roman supervision. Caesar's decision to restore the Helvetii to their original territory rather than enslaving or scattering them reflected his understanding that empty lands would invite Germanic settlement. But the tribe's military power was permanently broken. Archaeological evidence from Helvetii sites shows a dramatic reduction in weapon deposits and fortification construction after 58 BCE, indicating the thoroughness of their defeat. The success at Bibracte established Caesar's reputation among the Gallic tribes and initiated a complex diplomatic game that would characterize much of his subsequent campaign. Some tribes, recognizing Roman military superiority, sought alliance with Caesar as protection against traditional enemies. Others, understanding that Roman victory meant the end of Celtic independence, began forming coalitions to resist further Roman expansion. The Aedui and Remi became Caesar's primary Gallic allies, providing intelligence, supplies, and auxiliary troops that proved crucial in subsequent campaigns. The Germanic threat that had initially justified Roman intervention in Gaul materialized in the form of Ariovistus, a Suebi king who had established himself in Sequani territory and was attracting additional Germanic settlers across the Rhine. Ariovistus commanded an estimated 15,000 Germanic warriors and had begun imposing tribute on Gallic tribes while threatening to expand his territory further westward. The Germanic military tradition differed significantly from Celtic practices, emphasizing mobility, surprise attacks, and the psychological impact of their fearsome reputation. Caesar's campaign against Ariovistus demonstrated Roman adaptability and facing different tactical challenges. The Germanic warriors fought primarily as infantry but relied heavily on rapid movement and the psychological effect of their fierce appearance and war cries. Unlike Celtic warriors who sought individual glory in combat, Germanic fighters emphasized unit cohesion and mutual support that made them formidable opponents in forest and broken terrain where Roman formations had difficulty maintaining their tactical advantages. The confrontation with Ariovistus occurred in the Vosges region, where Caesar managed to force the Germanic king into pitched battle despite his preference for guerrilla tactics. The Roman victory was decisive but costly, with Caesar's legions suffering significant casualties before their superior armor and discipline prevailed. The defeat of Ariovistus eliminated the immediate Germanic threat and demonstrated to both Celtic and Germanic tribes that Roman military power could overcome any opponent in direct confrontation. The campaigns of 57 BCE shifted Caesar's attention to the Belgae, a confederation of Celtic tribes in northern Gaul who had maintained their independence through military prowess and strategic alliances. The Belgae possessed a well-deserved reputation as the fiercest warriors in Gaul, with their society organized around constant warfare and their young men trained from childhood in martial skills. Archaeological evidence from Belgae sites reveals extensive weapon production and fortification systems that indicate a society prepared for sustained military conflict. The Belgae Confederation included powerful tribes such as the Nervii, Ambrones, and Aduatuci, each contributing warriors to a combined force that Caesar estimated at nearly 300,000 men. This massive army represented the largest Celtic military effort yet assembled against Roman expansion. With tribal contingents maintaining their traditional organization while attempting to coordinate strategy through a council of war chiefs, the logistical challenges of maintaining such a large force in the field created vulnerabilities that Caesar was quick to exploit. Caesar's strategy against the Belgae involved dividing their confederation through diplomatic means, while using rapid movement to prevent the concentration of their full military strength. He negotiated separate agreements with some tribes while launching surprise attacks on others, creating confusion and mistrust within the Belgae alliance. The Roman ability to move quickly between different theaters of operation, supported by efficient supply systems and engineering capabilities, gave them strategic advantages that the Belgae could not match despite their numerical superiority. The siege of Sarbis demonstrated both Celtic tactical innovation and the continuing superiority of Roman military engineering. The Nervii, considered the most warlike of the Belgae tribes, had prepared elaborate riverside fortifications that utilized natural obstacles to channel Roman attacks into predetermined killing zones. Their warriors, armed with long spears and reinforced shields, fought from prepared positions that maximized their defensive advantages while minimizing Roman tactical flexibility. However, Roman siege techniques proved capable of overcoming even the most sophisticated Celtic fortifications. Caesar's engineers constructed elaborate siege works, including towers, rams, and protective galleries that enabled Roman forces to approach Celtic walls despite heavy missile fire. The systematic nature of Roman siege warfare, with its emphasis on engineering solutions and coordinated assault techniques, contrasted sharply with Celtic methods that relied primarily on individual courage and improvised tactics. The fall of Sarbis marked the effective end of organized Belgae resistance, though individual tribes continued fighting for several more years. The capture of the fortress provided Caesar with enormous quantities of slaves and booty that helped finance his subsequent campaigns while demonstrating to other Celtic tribes the futility of resisting Roman siege techniques. Archaeological excavations at Sarbis reveal the thoroughness of Roman destruction, with evidence of systematic demolition and the removal of valuable materials that left the site uninhabitable. The Aduatuci, the last major Belgae tribe to resist Roman conquest, attempted to negotiate surrender terms that would preserve their independence in exchange for tribute payments and hostages. Caesar's rejection of these terms and his subsequent siege of the hilltop fortress established the pattern that would characterize his treatment of Celtic resistance throughout the remaining campaigns. The Romans demanded unconditional surrender and complete submission, accepting no compromise that might leave Celtic military power intact. The siege of the Aduatuci fortress showcased Roman engineering capabilities that must have seemed almost supernatural to Celtic observers. Caesar's engineers constructed siege towers that overtopped the Celtic walls, enabling Roman archers and artillery to dominate the defenders, while assault troops prepared for the final attack. The Aduatuci, who had never encountered such sophisticated siege techniques, initially attempted to negotiate but ultimately chose to fight rather than submit to enslavement. The Roman assault on the Aduatuci fortress employed coordinated tactics that combined artillery, bombardment, infantry assault, and psychological warfare to overwhelm the defenders. The Celtic warriors, fighting from prepared positions on familiar terrain, inflicted significant casualties on the attacking Romans but could not match the systematic nature of Roman siege warfare. The fall of the fortress resulted in the enslavement of the entire Aduatuci population, estimated at 53,000 people, providing Caesar with enormous profits while eliminating another potential source of resistance. The maritime campaigns of 56 BCE brought Caesar into conflict with the Veneti, a Celtic tribe that controlled the Atlantic coast of Gaul and possessed the most sophisticated naval technology in the region. The Veneti had built their power on maritime trade, constructing vessels capable of ocean navigation and establishing trading relationships with Britain and other distant lands. Their ships, built with oak planks and leather sails, could navigate the treacherous waters of the Atlantic coast where Mediterranean-style galleys would founder. The Veneti rebellion began when Caesar demanded hostages and tribute from coastal tribes that had previously maintained their independence through maritime mobility. The Veneti leadership recognized that submission to Rome would mean the end of their profitable trading networks and their ability to retreat to island strongholds when threatened by land-based enemies. Their decision to resist Roman demands initiated a conflict that would test Caesar's adaptability and demonstrate the limitations of Roman military power when faced with unfamiliar tactical challenges. The naval warfare against the Veneti required Caesar to develop new tactical approaches and construct a fleet capable of operating in Atlantic waters. Roman naval tradition emphasized ramming attacks and boarding actions that were effective in Mediterranean conditions, but proved inadequate against the high-sided Celtic vessels designed for ocean navigation. The Veneti ships, with their flexible leather sails and shallow draft, could operate in waters where Roman galleys could not follow, creating strategic advantages that neutralized Roman superiority in land warfare. Caesar's solution involved adapting Roman naval tactics to Atlantic conditions while exploiting the technological advantages of Roman engineering. His engineers developed specialized equipment, including hooks and cutting tools designed to destroy Celtic rigging, while Roman crews trained in boarding techniques adapted to the different conditions of Atlantic naval warfare. The decisive engagement occurred in Quiberon Bay, where Roman tactical innovations overcame Celtic naval advantages through superior coordination and adapted equipment. The destruction of the Veneti fleet eliminated the last major source of Celtic resistance in Western Gaul, while providing Caesar with access to British trade networks that had previously been beyond Roman reach. The enslavement of the Veneti leadership and the destruction of their trading infrastructure marked the end of Celtic maritime independence and opened Atlantic waters to Roman commercial exploitation. Archaeological evidence from Veneti sites shows the thoroughness of Roman destruction, with coastal settlements abandoned and trading networks disrupted for generations. The completion of Caesar's Gallic campaigns left one significant Celtic stronghold beyond the reach of Roman legions, the mysterious islands of Britannia, whose white cliffs could be glimpsed across the treacherous waters of the English Channel on clear days from the Gallic coast. The wealth and warriors that flowed from Britain to support Gallic resistance had not escaped Caesar's attention during his 8 years of campaigning, nor had the strategic implications of leaving a potential base for future Celtic resurgence unconquered. The decision to launch expeditions across the Channel represented both the logical culmination of his Gallic conquests and a calculated political gamble that would enhance his reputation in Rome, while gathering intelligence about this enigmatic Celtic realm. Caesar's first expedition to Britain in 55 BCE was launched with 2 legions and auxiliary cavalry, a force totaling approximately 12,000 men aboard a hastily assembled fleet of transport vessels and warships. The Romans had little experience with tidal waters or the unpredictable weather patterns of the English Channel, challenges that became immediately apparent as the invasion fleet struggled against contrary winds and strong currents that scattered the carefully organized formation. The sight of the Roman ships approaching the British coast drew thousands of Celtic warriors to the clifftops and beaches, their war chariots racing along the shoreline while cavalry units positioned themselves to contest any landing attempt. The British Celts who gathered to oppose Caesar's landing represented a sophisticated military culture that had evolved differently from their continental cousins. Archaeological evidence from British sites reveals that chariot warfare had continued to develop in Britain long after it had been abandoned in Gaul, with British craftsmen creating lighter, more maneuverable vehicles specifically designed for rapid tactical movement across varied terrain. These war chariots, drawn by carefully bred ponies and crewed by skilled warriors and drivers, provided the British Celts with mobility advantages that continental tribes had lost to Roman tactical innovations. The initial Roman landing near Deal encountered fierce resistance from British warriors who waded into the surf to attack the Roman ships before they could reach the beach. The British fighters, many painted with blue woad and wearing minimal armor to enhance their mobility in water, demonstrated remarkable courage in attacking heavily armed Roman legionaries while standing waist-deep in the churning waves. Their long shields and spears gave them reach advantages in the confined space between ships and shore, while their intimate knowledge of local tidal conditions enabled them to exploit Roman unfamiliarity with beach warfare. Caesar's tactical response to this unexpected challenge demonstrated the adaptability that had served him throughout the Gallic campaigns. He ordered his warships to move parallel to the shore and use their artillery to clear British defenders from the beach, while simultaneously landing troops at multiple points to divide British attention and prevent the concentration of their forces. The Roman standard-bearer of the 10th Legion played a crucial role in the successful landing by leaping into the water while carrying the legion's eagle, shaming his comrades into following him ashore rather than remaining safely aboard their transport vessels. The establishment of a Roman beachhead on British soil marked the first time that Celtic Britain had faced invasion by a disciplined foreign army, though the expedition's limited scope prevented any permanent conquest. Caesar's forces, constrained by supply difficulties in the approaching winter season, conducted only brief forays inland before returning to Gaul after 18 days on British soil. However, these limited operations provided valuable intelligence about British geography, tribal organization, and military capabilities that would prove crucial for future Roman planning. The British response to Caesar's first expedition revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Celtic political organization in Britain. Several tribes, including the Trinovants and some Kentish groups, sent envoys to Caesar offering submission and hostages, recognizing that Roman military superiority made resistance futile. Other tribes, particularly those in the interior regions who had not witnessed Roman capabilities firsthand, prepared for continued resistance by forming military alliances and strengthening their fortifications against future invasion attempts. Caesar's second expedition in 54 BCE involved a much larger force of 5 legions plus auxiliary troops, transported by a fleet of over 800 vessels that represented the largest seaborne invasion force assembled in ancient history up to that point. The logistical challenges of organizing such an expedition required months of preparation, including the construction of specialized transport ships designed to carry cavalry horses and siege equipment across the channel. The scale of these preparations sent clear signals to British tribes that Rome intended serious conquest rather than mere raiding. The landing of this massive Roman force proceeded more smoothly than the previous year's expedition, with British resistance hampered by the sheer scale of the invasion and the improved Roman understanding of local conditions. However, the British Celts had also learned from their previous encounters with Roman tactics, developing new strategies that emphasized mobility and guerrilla warfare rather than direct confrontation with Roman legions in pitched battle. The British war chariots proved particularly effective in this role, using their speed and maneuverability to strike at Roman foraging parties and supply lines before disappearing into the dense forests that covered much of southeastern Britain. The most formidable British leader to emerge during Caesar's second expedition was Cassivellaunus, king of the Catavellani tribe, who demonstrated remarkable strategic insight in organizing British resistance. Rather than attempting to match Roman legions in conventional warfare, Cassivellaunus disbanded most of his infantry forces and relied primarily on cavalry and chariot units to conduct a campaign of harassment and attrition. His warriors avoided Roman strengths while exploiting their weaknesses, particularly their dependence on regular supply deliveries and their unfamiliarity with British terrain. Cassivellaunus established his primary stronghold north of the Thames, using the river as a natural barrier that forced the Romans to extend their lines of communication while operating in unfamiliar territory. The British king's strategy involved drawing Roman forces deeper into the interior while using mobile units to attack their supply trains and isolated detachments. This approach proved remarkably effective, forcing Caesar to commit significant resources to protecting his logistics while limiting his ability to conduct offensive operations against British settlements. The Roman crossing of the Thames represented a significant tactical achievement that demonstrated their engineering capabilities and tactical flexibility. Caesar's forces constructed a fortified ford that enabled them to cross the river despite British attempts to block the crossing with stakes and obstacles. The successful passage of Roman legions across this formidable natural barrier marked a turning point in the campaign, forcing Cassivellaunus to abandon his defensive strategy and seek diplomatic solutions to avoid complete defeat. The submission of Cassivellaunus and several other British tribes provided Caesar with the political victory he needed to justify his expeditions, though the practical results remained limited. The British king agreed to pay tribute and provide hostages, while several other tribes formally acknowledged Roman supremacy. However, these agreements proved largely symbolic, as Roman forces withdrew from Britain shortly after their conclusion, leaving no permanent garrison or administrative structure to enforce compliance with the negotiated terms. The impact of Caesar's expeditions on British Celtic society extended far beyond their immediate military and political consequences. Archaeological evidence from sites across southeastern Britain reveals significant changes in material culture, trade patterns, and settlement organization that began during this period and continued for decades afterward. Roman goods, including pottery, metalwork, and coins, appear in increasing quantities at British sites, indicating the establishment of regular commercial relationships that survived the end of military contact. The political ramifications of Caesar's expeditions created lasting changes in the balance of power among British tribes. Those groups that had supported Rome gained advantages over traditional rivals, while tribes that had resisted Roman demands found themselves isolated and vulnerable to attack by pro-Roman neighbors. This dynamic contributed to a gradual centralization of political authority in southeastern Britain, as successful leaders consolidated control over larger territories and more diverse populations. The century between Caesar's expeditions and the Claudian invasion of 43 CE witnessed significant developments in Romano-British relations that laid the groundwork for eventual conquest. British tribes maintained diplomatic contacts with Rome, sending embassies to successive emperors and involving themselves in Roman political disputes. Archaeological evidence reveals increasing Roman influence on British material culture, with British craftsmen adopting Roman techniques and styles, while Roman merchants established permanent trading relationships with British suppliers. The reign of Cunobelinus, king of the Catavellani, exemplified the complex relationship between British Celtic elites and Roman power during this transitional period. Cunobelinus, whom Shakespeare would later immortalize as Cymbeline, controlled much of southeastern Britain from his capital at Camulogenum and maintained careful diplomatic relations with Rome, while preserving British independence. His coins, minted in Roman style but featuring Celtic symbols and inscriptions, symbolized the cultural synthesis that characterized this period of Romano-British interaction. The death of Cunobelinus around 40 CE created a succession crisis that provided Rome with the opportunity for renewed intervention in British affairs. His sons Caratacus and Togedumnus adopted more aggressive policies toward Rome and began expanding Cativalonian territory at the expense of pro-Roman tribes like the Atrebites. The resulting instability threatened Roman commercial interests and provided Emperor Claudius with the justification he needed for a full-scale invasion of Britain. The Claudian invasion of 43 CE represented a fundamentally different approach to British conquest than Caesar's earlier expeditions. Where Caesar had sought quick political victories to enhance his reputation, Claudius planned systematic conquest and permanent occupation that would add Britain to the Roman Empire as a fully integrated province. The invasion force of 4 legions plus auxiliary troops, totaling approximately 40,000 men, was supported by a massive logistical apparatus designed to sustain long-term military operations and eventual civilian administration. The Roman landing at Richborough proceeded without the fierce resistance that had characterized Caesar's expeditions, partly due to improved Roman planning and partly because British attention was focused on internal political disputes following Cunobelinus' death. The establishment of a secure beachhead and supply base enabled Roman forces to begin systematic advance inland, using engineering capabilities to construct roads and fortifications that would support permanent occupation rather than temporary raiding. The initial British response to the Claudian invasion revealed the continuing political fragmentation that weakened Celtic resistance throughout the conquest period. While Caratacus and Togedumnus attempted to organize coordinated resistance, other British leaders chose accommodation with Rome or remained neutral in hopes of preserving their local authority. The Atrebates under Verica actively supported the Roman invasion, providing intelligence and auxiliary troops that proved crucial in the early stages of the campaign. The Battle of the Medway demonstrated both the tactical evolution of British Celtic warfare and the continuing superiority of Roman military organization. The British forces, commanded by Caratacus and Togedumnus, attempted to use the river as a defensive barrier while relying on their traditional advantages in mobility and local knowledge. However, Roman tactical innovations, including the use of auxiliary troops trained in river-crossing techniques and coordinated artillery support, enabled them to force the crossing despite determined British resistance. The death of Togedumnus during the Medway campaign eliminated one of the most capable British military leaders and forced Caratacus to retreat westward into Wales, where he would continue resistance for several more years. The Roman victory opened the route to Camulogenum, the most important British settlement and the symbolic center of Catuvalonian power. The capture of the stronghold provided the Romans with a secure base for further operations while demonstrating to other British tribes the futility of continued resistance. The submission of numerous British tribes following the fall of Camulogenum enabled the Romans to establish a client kingdom system that would govern much of Britain for the next 2 decades. Friendly British rulers were allowed to maintain local authority in exchange for tribute payments and military support, while Roman garrisons controlled strategic points and settlements. This system enabled the Romans to control large territories with relatively small military forces while gradually introducing Roman administrative and legal systems. Caratacus' continued resistance from his Welsh strongholds posed the most serious challenge to Roman consolidation in Britain. The mountainous terrain of Wales favored guerrilla warfare tactics that had proven effective against Roman legions in other frontier regions, while the fierce independence of Welsh tribes provided Caratacus with potential allies who had not been overawed by Roman victories in the lowlands. His ability to maintain organized resistance for nearly a decade after the initial invasion demonstrated both his personal capabilities and the continuing vitality of Celtic military culture. The Roman campaigns in Wales required different tactical approaches than the conquest of lowland Britain. The mountainous terrain limited the effectiveness of Roman cavalry and artillery, while favoring British tactics that emphasized mobility and surprise attacks. Roman engineering capabilities proved crucial in these operations, with the construction of roads and fortifications enabling legions to maintain supply lines and secure bases despite operating in hostile territory far from their primary bases. The final defeat and capture of Caratacus in 51 CE marked the end of organized British resistance to Roman rule in the initial conquest period. His betrayal by Cartimandua, Queen of the Brigantes, illustrated the complex political calculations that British leaders faced when dealing with Roman power. Cartimandua's decision to hand over Caratacus to the Romans secured her own position as a client ruler while eliminating a potential rival for leadership of British resistance. The treatment of Caratacus following his capture demonstrated Roman political sophistication in dealing with defeated enemies. Rather than executing the British leader, Emperor Claudius granted him clemency and allowed him to live in Rome as an honored prisoner, a decision that served Roman propaganda purposes while eliminating the possibility of Caratacus becoming a martyr for continued British resistance. The British king's dignified speech to the Roman Senate, recorded by Tacitus, provided a fitting end to the heroic phase of British Celtic resistance. The decade following Caratacus' defeat witnessed the gradual extension of Roman control throughout lowland Britain and the beginning of systematic Romanization policies designed to integrate British Celtic elites into imperial administration. The establishment of colony at Camulodunum and other strategic locations provided centers for Roman culture and administration, while the construction of roads, aqueducts, and other infrastructure demonstrated the benefits of Roman rule to British populations. However, the heavy-handed implementation of Roman policies, particularly the confiscation of tribal lands for veteran settlements and the imposition of heavy taxation, created growing resentment among British CELTS who'd initially accepted Roman rule. The situation was further complicated by the behavior of Roman officials and colonists, many of whom treated the Britons with contempt and exploited their positions for personal gain. These tensions would eventually explode into the most serious revolt against Roman rule in British history. The immediate cause of Boudicca's rebellion in 60 CE arose from the brutal treatment of the Iceni royal family following the death of King Prasutagus. The Iceni had maintained their independence as a client kingdom under Roman protection, with Prasutagus attempting to secure his family's position by naming Emperor Nero as co-heir alongside his daughters. However, Roman officials chose to interpret this arrangement as justification for annexing Iceni territory outright, while subjecting Boudicca and her daughters to humiliating and violent treatment that violated both Roman law and Celtic concepts of honor. The flogging of Boudicca and the rape of her daughters represented not merely personal crimes, but symbolic attacks on Celtic dignity and independence that resonated throughout British tribal society. The Roman actions violated fundamental Celtic beliefs about the sanctity of royal authority and the protection owed to women of high status, creating grievances that transcended tribal boundaries and united previously disparate groups in common cause against Roman rule. Boudicca's revolt began with a massacre of Roman colonists at Camulodunum, where British warriors destroyed the hated temple of Claudius that had been built with forced British labor and maintained through compulsory contributions from conquered tribes. Archaeological evidence from the destruction layer at Camulodunum reveals the thoroughness of British vengeance, with Roman buildings systematically demolished and their occupants killed without regard for age or gender. The psychological impact of this victory provided momentum for the rebellion while demonstrating British capability for organized military action. The destruction of the 9th Legion's infantry detachment during their attempt to relieve Camulodunum eliminated a significant portion of Roman military strength in Britain, while providing the rebels with weapons and equipment that enhanced their fighting capability. The ambush of these experienced Roman troops demonstrated that British forces had learned from their previous encounters with Roman tactics and could exploit Roman overconfidence and tactical rigidity when circumstances favored Celtic methods of warfare. The sack of Londinium marked the zenith of Boudicca's rebellion, but the systematic destruction of 3 major Roman settlements could not alter the fundamental military realities that governed Roman Britain. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, having completed his campaign against the Druids on Anglesey, assembled his remaining forces and prepared for the decisive confrontation that would determine whether Roman rule in Britain would survive its greatest challenge. The British forces, swollen by success and driven by decades of accumulated grievances, numbered perhaps 100,000 warriors drawn from tribes across southeastern Britain, but their very numbers created logistical problems that would prove fatal in sustained campaign conditions. The final battle between Boudicca's forces and Paulinus' legions occurred at an unidentified location somewhere in the Midlands, where the Roman governor chose terrain that neutralized British numerical advantages while maximizing the effectiveness of Roman tactical discipline. Paulinus positioned his approximately 10,000 troops in a narrow valley with wooded hills protecting his flanks, forcing the British forces to attack frontally across open ground, where Roman artillery and coordinated missile fire could inflict maximum casualties before hand-to-hand combat began. The British assault followed traditional Celtic patterns, with warriors advancing in loose formations while shouting war cries and displaying individual prowess through elaborate weapons, handling, and personal challenges. However, the confined terrain prevented the British from utilizing their advantages in mobility and chariot warfare, while their vast numbers created crowding that hindered effective weapon use and made retreat difficult once the Roman counterattack began. The presence of British families and wagons positioned behind the battle line, intended to inspire the warriors and share in the anticipated victory, instead created obstacles that trapped fleeing fighters when the tide of battle turned. The Roman tactical response demonstrated the lethal efficiency of professional military organization when properly deployed. The legions maintained their formation integrity throughout the British assault, using coordinated javelin volleys to disrupt Celtic charges before engaging with short swords in close combat, where Roman training and equipment provided decisive advantages. The auxiliary cavalry, held in reserve during the initial engagement, exploited the British collapse by pursuing fleeing warriors and preventing any possibility of rallying or regrouping for continued resistance. The slaughter that followed the British defeat effectively ended organized Celtic resistance in lowland Britain for generations. Tacitus records that 80,000 Britons died in the battle and subsequent pursuit, while Roman casualties numbered only 400 killed and slightly more wounded. These figures, even allowing for typical ancient exaggeration, indicate a massacre that eliminated not merely an army, but much of the military leadership and warrior class of southeastern British tribes. Boudicca herself died shortly after the battle, either from poison or illness, removing the final symbol of British independence. The aftermath of Boudicca's defeat initiated a fundamental transformation in Roman policy toward Britain that would shape the province's development for the next 3 centuries. The rebellion had demonstrated both the dangers of heavy-handed exploitation and the potential for British loyalty when properly cultivated. Paulinus' initial response involved harsh reprisals against tribes that had supported the revolt, but his replacement by Petronius to Apilianus marked a shift toward conciliation and systematic romanization that would prove far more effective than military coercion alone. The process of romanization in Britain began with the reconstruction of destroyed settlements on grander scales that demonstrated both Roman power and the benefits of imperial rule. Londinium, rebuilt as the province's commercial and administrative center, featured stone buildings, paved streets, and public amenities that surpassed anything previously seen in Britain. The new forum, basilica, and amphitheater provided spaces for Roman-style civic life, while the construction of public baths, temples, and aqueducts introduced British populations to Mediterranean standards of urban living. Camulodunum's reconstruction as Clunia Claudia Victorcensis established the template for Roman colonial development throughout Britain. The settlement combined veteran military colonists with Romanist British elites in a community designed to serve as a showcase of Roman civilization. The massive temple complex dedicated to Claudius, rebuilt after its destruction during Boudicca's revolt, dominated the town's skyline while serving as a center for the imperial cult that bound provincial populations to the emperor through religious observance. The development of villa culture in Roman Britain represented, perhaps, the most successful aspect of Romanization, creating a synthesis of Roman architectural forms with British agricultural practices that would persist long after the end of imperial rule. The earliest villas appeared in the late 1st century CE in areas of Kent and the Thames Valley where Roman influence was strongest, but the concept gradually spread throughout lowland Britain as British elites adopted Roman lifestyle markers to maintain their social status under the new political order. British villa construction evolved from simple farmhouses with Roman decorative elements to elaborate complexes that rivaled Italian country estates in their sophistication and luxury. The villa at Fishbourne in Sussex, possibly built for the client king Cogidubnus, covered over 6 acres and featured formal gardens, elaborate mosaics, and hippocaust heating systems that demonstrated the complete adoption of Roman domestic technology. The scale and expense of such constructions required enormous agricultural surpluses and indicated the successful integration of British landowners into imperial economic networks. The agricultural innovations that supported villa development transformed British farming practices and significantly increased productivity across the province. Roman agricultural writers like Columella and Pliny provided detailed instructions for crop rotation, soil improvement, and livestock breeding that British farmers adapted to local conditions. The introduction of new crops, including grapes, walnuts, and various vegetables, expanded dietary options while creating opportunities for specialized agricultural production that could supply urban markets and export networks. The Roman villa system also facilitated the transfer of Mediterranean craft technologies to Britain, with villa workshops producing pottery, metalwork, and textiles using techniques learned from continental craftsmen. Archaeological evidence from villa sites reveals sophisticated production facilities including pottery kilns, metalworking forges, and textile workshops that supplied both local needs and regional markets. The standardization of products across different villa sites suggests the development of quality control systems and trade networks that connected British producers with consumers throughout the province. Urban development under Roman rule created entirely new forms of settlement that served as centers for administration, commerce, and cultural transformation. Towns like Verulamium, Cirencester and Winchester grew from small Celtic settlements into substantial urban centers, with populations reaching 5,000 to 10,000 inhabitants. These communities featured the full range of Roman urban amenities, including forums, basilicas, theaters, amphitheaters, and public baths that provided venues for Roman-style civic and social life. The construction of Roman towns required massive investments in infrastructure that demonstrated imperial commitment to provincial development. The engineering challenges involved in building aqueducts, sewers, and paved streets in British conditions necessitated the training of local craftsmen in Roman construction techniques while providing employment for thousands of workers. The economic impact of urban construction projects stimulated local industries and created markets for building materials that encouraged entrepreneurial activity throughout the province. Roman legal and administrative systems gradually replaced traditional Celtic law and governance, though the transition occurred over several generations and involved considerable adaptation to local conditions. The establishment of civitates based on pre-existing tribal territories allowed for continuity in local leadership while introducing Roman legal concepts and administrative procedures. British aristocrats who accepted Roman citizenship gained access to imperial legal protections and commercial opportunities while retaining authority over their traditional followers. The Roman legal system's emphasis on written law and formal procedures contrasted sharply with Celtic traditions of oral law and personal arbitration, creating challenges that required careful management to avoid social disruption. Roman administrators worked with British legal experts to codify customary laws and establish procedures that combined Roman legal principles with Celtic traditions of dispute resolution. The gradual adoption of Roman legal concepts occurred primarily through practical necessity as increased commercial activity and urban development created situations that traditional Celtic law could not adequately address. Roman educational systems introduced literacy and classical learning to British elites, creating a Romanist intellectual class that would serve as intermediaries between imperial administration and local populations. The establishment of schools in major towns provided instruction in Latin language and literature, Roman history and law, and Greek philosophy that equipped British students for careers in imperial service. Archaeological evidence from writing tablets found at sites like Vindolanda reveals the extent to which literacy penetrated British society, with routine correspondence and administrative documents demonstrating widespread familiarity with written communication. Despite the comprehensive nature of Romanization efforts, Celtic cultural elements persisted throughout the Roman period and in many cases merged with Roman traditions to create distinctive Romano-British cultural forms. Religious syncretism proved particularly important in this process, with Celtic deities acquiring Roman names and attributes while retaining their essential characteristics and continuing to receive worship from both Celtic and Roman populations. The goddess Sulis, worshipped at the hot springs of Bath, exemplified this religious fusion by becoming identified with the Roman Minerva, while maintaining her specifically Celtic associations with healing waters and prophetic powers. The elaborate temple complex built at Bath combined Roman architectural forms with Celtic religious traditions, creating a pilgrimage site that attracted visitors from throughout Britain and Gaul. The thousands of cursed tablets deposited in the sacred spring demonstrate the persistence of Celtic magical practices within a Roman religious framework. Celtic artistic traditions adapted to Roman tastes and techniques, while maintaining distinctive stylistic elements that distinguished Romano-British art from purely Roman forms. Metalworkers continued to produce torques, brooches, and other ornaments featuring traditional Celtic motifs, but they incorporated Roman decorative elements and manufacturing techniques that enhanced both the quality and market appeal of their products. The result was a hybrid artistic tradition that satisfied both Celtic cultural preferences and Roman aesthetic standards. The survival of Celtic languages throughout the Roman period indicates the limited penetration of Latin beyond administrative and commercial contexts. While urban elites and those involved in imperial service became fluent in Latin, the majority of the British population continued to speak Celtic languages in their daily lives. Place-name evidence suggests that Celtic linguistic traditions remained dominant in rural areas, with Latin primarily serving as a language of government, trade, and formal education, rather than replacing native speech patterns. Celtic social structures proved remarkably resilient under Roman rule, with traditional kinship networks and tribal loyalties continuing to influence social organization despite the imposition of Roman administrative systems. The Roman practice of governing through existing elite families allowed Celtic aristocrats to maintain their social positions while adapting to new political realities. Marriage alliances between Roman officials and British nobility created networks of personal relationships that facilitated cultural exchange while preserving Celtic social hierarchies. The role of Celtic elites in Roman administration became increasingly important as the province developed and required more sophisticated governance structures. British aristocrats who acquired Roman citizenship and education found opportunities for advancement in imperial service, with some achieving high positions in the provincial administration and military commands. The career of Agricola's father-in-law, who rose from local British nobility to become a Roman senator, illustrates the possibilities available to those who successfully navigated the transition from Celtic to Roman identity. Military service provided another avenue for Celtic advancement within the Roman system, with British auxiliary units serving throughout the empire and achieving distinguished records in frontier warfare. The Batavian cavalry units recruited from British tribes became renowned for their skill and loyalty, serving in campaigns from Germany to Dacia and earning recognition from emperors and military commanders. The military diplomas awarded to retiring auxiliaries provided pathways to Roman citizenship and social advancement that benefited entire families and communities. Economic transformation under Roman rule involved the integration of British production into Mediterranean trade networks that connected the province with markets throughout the empire. British exports including wool, hides, hunting dogs, and slaves found ready markets in Gaul and Italy, while imports of wine, olive oil, pottery, and luxury goods provided British consumers with access to Mediterranean products and lifestyle options. The development of standardized coinage and commercial law facilitated this trade, while creating opportunities for British merchants and entrepreneurs. Agricultural intensification supported this commercial expansion by generating surpluses that could be traded for imported goods and services. Roman agricultural techniques, including improved plowing methods, crop rotation systems, and livestock breeding programs, significantly increased productivity per acre while reducing labor requirements. The construction of granaries, mills, and processing facilities enabled efficient handling of agricultural surpluses while creating employment opportunities in rural areas. Industrial production in Roman Britain developed beyond traditional craft activities to include large-scale manufacturing operations that supplied both local and export markets. Pottery production centers in the Nene Valley and New Forest regions achieved industrial scales of operation, with standardized products distributed throughout Britain and exported to continental markets. Iron production in the Weald of Kent and Sussex expanded dramatically under Roman management, with sophisticated smelting operations producing both raw materials and finished goods for military and civilian use. The Roman road system revolutionized transportation and communications throughout Britain, connecting previously isolated regions with major urban centers and facilitating the movement of goods, people, and information. The construction of roads like Watling Street, Ermine Street, and the Fossway required enormous investments in engineering and labor, but created permanent infrastructure that supported economic development for centuries. The standardized construction techniques and maintenance systems ensured reliable transportation even in difficult weather conditions that had previously made travel dangerous or impossible. Mining operations under Roman management exploited British mineral resources on unprecedented scales, with lead production in the Mendips and Pennines, silver extraction in Wales, and gold mining in Scotland generating substantial revenues for both local communities and the imperial treasury. The technical expertise required for deep mining operations necessitated the import of specialized workers and equipment from other provinces, creating opportunities for technology transfer and skill development among British workers. The persistence of Celtic cultural elements within this transformed economic and social landscape demonstrates the selective nature of Romanicization and the agency of British populations in determining which aspects of Roman culture to adopt or reject. While urban elites embraced Roman lifestyle markers and educational systems, rural populations maintained traditional practices and beliefs that provided continuity with pre-Roman Celtic culture. This cultural persistence would prove crucial during the later imperial period, when Roman political control weakened and Celtic traditions provided alternative sources of identity and organization. The gradual withdrawal of Roman legions from Britain beginning in the late 4th century CE created a power vacuum that would fundamentally reshape Celtic civilization. Yet this apparent collapse of imperial authority paradoxically enabled one of the most remarkable cultural transformations in European history. As Roman administrative structures crumbled and urban centers declined, Celtic societies across Britain and Ireland underwent a profound spiritual revolution that would not only preserve their cultural heritage, but also position them as leaders in the Christianization of medieval Europe. The introduction of Christianity to Celtic lands occurred through multiple channels and over several centuries, beginning with the missionary activities of figures like Saint Ninian in Scotland around 400 CE and culminating in the comprehensive conversion of Ireland under St. Patrick's influence in the mid-5th century. Unlike the often violent imposition of Christianity in other parts of the former Roman Empire, the Celtic conversion process demonstrated remarkable adaptability, with Christian missionaries skillfully incorporating existing Celtic religious practices and sacred sites into their evangelical strategies rather than attempting to completely eradicate pagan traditions. St. Patrick's mission to Ireland exemplified this syncretic approach to conversion, though the historical Patrick differs significantly from the legendary figure celebrated in later hagiographical accounts. Born into a Romano-British family around 390 CE, Patrick experienced firsthand the collapse of Roman authority when Irish raiders captured him as a teenager and enslaved him for 6 years in Ireland. This traumatic experience, rather than creating hostility toward Irish culture, provided Patrick with intimate knowledge of Celtic society, language, and religious practices that would prove invaluable in his later missionary work. Patrick's return to Ireland as a bishop around 432 CE marked the beginning of systematic Christian evangelization that would transform Irish society within a single generation. His approach involved establishing episcopal centers at existing pagan religious sites, particularly hilltop locations that had served as assembly places for Celtic tribes. The famous Hill of Tara, traditional seat of the High Kings of Ireland, became one of Patrick's primary targets for conversion, with the saint reportedly confronting the Druids in direct theological debate during the celebration of Beltane, the Celtic Spring Festival. The rapid success of Patrick stemmed from his understanding that Christianity could provide Irish Celtic society with organizational structures and intellectual frameworks that enhanced rather than replaced traditional cultural values. The Christian emphasis on literacy and learning appealed to Celtic elites who had maintained oral traditions for centuries, but recognized the advantages of written communication for legal, commercial, and administrative purposes. The monastic system that Patrick introduced offered alternative pathways to social advancement that complemented existing Celtic institutions rather than competing with them. The development of Irish monasticism created entirely new forms of religious organization that would influence Christian practice throughout medieval Europe. Unlike the urban-based episcopal system that evolved in the Roman Empire, Irish Christianity adapted to the rural, tribal nature of Celtic society by establishing monastic communities that served as centers for education, craft production, and agricultural innovation. These monasteries, often founded on islands or in remote valleys, provided secure environments for scholarly activity while maintaining connections with surrounding communities through their economic and educational functions. The monastery at Clonmacnoise, founded by Saint Cyran around 548 CE on the banks of the River Shannon, exemplified the Irish monastic model that would spread throughout Celtic lands and beyond. The site's strategic location at the intersection of major river and land routes enabled it to serve as a center for trade and communication, while its extensive land supported a community of several hundred monks engaged in manuscript copying, metalworking, stone carving, and agricultural experimentation. Archaeological excavations at Clonmacnoise have revealed sophisticated workshops where monks produced illuminated manuscripts, carved stone crosses, and crafted metalwork that combined Christian symbolism with traditional Celtic artistic motifs. The preservation of Celtic culture through monastic scriptoriums represents one of the most significant intellectual achievements of the early medieval period. Irish monks working in monasteries like Clonmacnoise, Glendalough, and Armagh copied not only Christian texts, but also preserved vast quantities of Celtic literature, law codes, genealogies, and historical records that would otherwise have been lost. The decision to write down previously oral traditions required the development of standardized orthographies for Celtic languages and the creation of new vocabulary to express Christian concepts in native tongues. The famous Book of Kells, produced in Irish monasteries around 800 CE, demonstrates the sophisticated synthesis of Christian and Celtic artistic traditions that characterize this period. The manuscript's elaborate illuminations feature interlacing patterns derived from Latina metalwork, zoomorphic designs rooted in Celtic religious symbolism, and innovative combinations of colors and forms that created entirely new artistic vocabularies. The technical skill required for such productions necessitated decades of training and access to expensive materials, including vellum, gold leaf, and exotic pigments that could only be obtained through extensive trade networks. Irish monastic schools attracted students from throughout Britain and continental Europe, earning Ireland the designation land of saints and scholars that reflected its reputation as a center of Christian learning. The curriculum at these schools combined traditional Celtic education in law, poetry, and genealogy with Christian theology, Latin literature, and Greek philosophy, creating learned men who possessed both deep knowledge of their own cultural traditions and familiarity with Mediterranean intellectual heritage. This educational synthesis produced scholars capable of serving as missionaries, teachers, and administrators throughout medieval Europe. The missionary activities of Irish monks during the 6th through 8th centuries established Celtic Christian influence from Scotland to Italy, with figures like St. Columba, St. Columbanus, and St. Gall founding monasteries that became major centers of learning and cultural transmission. St. Columba's establishment of the monastery on Iona around 563 CE created a base for the conversion of Scotland and northern England, while his missionary activities among the Picts demonstrated the adaptability of Celtic Christianity to diverse cultural contexts. Columba's approach to missionary work among the Picts involved careful study of their social organization and religious practices, enabling him to present Christianity in terms that resonated with existing cultural values. Archaeological evidence from Pictish sites shows the gradual adoption of Christian symbols alongside traditional Pictish artistic motifs, suggesting a process of cultural synthesis rather than wholesale replacement of native traditions. The famous Pictish symbol stones from this period display Christian crosses integrated with traditional symbols like the double disc and zirad, indicating the successful merger of Christian and Celtic religious concepts. The monastery on Iona became a major center for manuscript production and artistic innovation, with monks developing distinctive styles of illumination and stone carving that influenced Christian art throughout Britain and Ireland. The Iona scriptorium produced numerous gospel books and liturgical texts that were distributed to daughter houses throughout Scotland and northern England, spreading both Christian doctrine and Celtic artistic traditions across wide geographical areas. The monastery's strategic location in the Inner Hebrides enabled it to maintain connections with both Irish and Scottish communities, while serving as a way station for travelers and pilgrims moving between different Celtic regions. St. Columbanus' continental missions, beginning around 590 CE, established Celtic Christian influence in Frankish territories and northern Italy, creating a network of monasteries that preserved Celtic traditions while adapting to continental European conditions. Columbanus founded major monasteries at Annegry, Luxeuil, and Fontaine in Burgundy, before moving to Italy where he established Bobbio, which became one of medieval Europe's most important centers of learning and manuscript preservation. The rule of Columbanus, which governed life in his monasteries, combined Irish monastic traditions with innovations adapted to continental conditions, creating a distinctive form of religious organization that attracted followers throughout the Frankish kingdoms. Columbanus' emphasis on rigorous asceticism, scholarly activity, and work appealed to both Celtic and Germanic populations, seeking alternatives to the increasingly worldly episcopal hierarchy that dominated continental Christianity. His monasteries became centers for the preservation of classical texts and the development of new forms of Christian scholarship that would influence medieval intellectual development. The conflicts between Celtic and Roman Christian practices that emerged during this period reflected deeper cultural differences regarding religious authority, liturgical practices, and ecclesiastical organization. The famous Synod of Whitby in 664 CE, where King Oswic of Northumbria chose to follow Roman rather than Celtic practices regarding the calculation of Easter, symbolized the broader struggle between different models of Christian organization that was occurring throughout formerly Celtic territories. However, the apparent victory of Roman Christianity at Whitby did not eliminate Celtic influence on Christian development in Britain and Ireland. Celtic monasticism continued to flourish, and Celtic artistic traditions remained influential in manuscript illumination, stone carving, and metalwork production. The synthesis of Celtic and Roman Christian elements created distinctive regional traditions that preserved important aspects of Celtic culture, while facilitating integration into broader European Christian networks. The political developments that accompanied Christianization involved the emergence of post-Roman kingdoms that drew upon both Celtic traditions and Christian concepts of kingship to create new forms of political organization. In Wales, kingdoms like Gwynedd, Powys and Dyft developed from earlier tribal territories but adopted Christian symbols and ceremonies that legitimized royal authority while maintaining connections to pre-Christian Celtic concepts of sacred kingship. The law of Hywel Dda, codified in 10th century Wales but reflecting earlier traditions, demonstrates the synthesis of Celtic legal concepts with Christian moral principles that characterized post-Roman Celtic societies. The law code preserved traditional Celtic emphases on compensation rather than punishment for most crimes while incorporating Christian concepts of marriage, property rights, and social responsibility. The detailed regulations regarding the treatment of women, children, and slaves reflected Christian influence, while maintaining distinctively Celtic approaches to social organization and dispute resolution. In Scotland, the emergence of the Kingdom of Dalriada from Irish settlements in Argyll created a political entity that maintained connections with both Irish and Pictish traditions while developing distinctive Scottish characteristics. The famous Census Fearin Albin, a genealogical and legal text that recorded the organization of Dalriada, demonstrates the persistence of Celtic kinship structures and legal concepts within a Christianized political framework. The text's detailed information about military obligations, tribute payments, and territorial divisions reveals sophisticated administrative systems that combined Celtic traditions with innovations adapted to Scottish conditions. The gradual unification of Scotland under Kenneth MacAlpin in the mid-9th century involved the merger of Pictish and Scottish kingdoms through processes that preserved important elements of both cultures while creating new synthetic traditions. Archaeological evidence from sites like Dun Ad, the royal center of Dalriada, reveals the continuation of Celtic artistic traditions alongside the adoption of Christian symbols and practices. The famous footprint carved into the rock at Dun Ad, used in royal inauguration ceremonies, demonstrates the persistence of ancient Celtic concepts of sacred kingship within Christian political frameworks. Irish political development during this period involved the complex interaction of traditional tribal structures with Christian concepts of authority and law. The emergence of powerful dynasties like the Uí Néill in the north and the Uganachta in the south created larger political units that maintained Celtic organizational principles while adopting Christian legitimization strategies. The concept of the High King of Ireland, while never achieving practical political unity, provided a framework for understanding Irish political relationships that combined ancient Celtic ideas about sacred kingship with Christian concepts of divinely appointed authority. The Brecon Laws, the comprehensive legal system that governed Irish society throughout the medieval period, exemplify the successful synthesis of Celtic and Christian legal traditions. These laws, preserved in manuscripts copied by monastic scribes, maintain traditional Celtic emphases on compensation, kinship obligations, and social status while incorporating Christian moral principles and ecclesiastical privileges. The detailed regulations regarding marriage, property, and social relationships reveal a sophisticated legal system that adapted ancient Celtic practices to Christian social ideals. The interactions between Celtic kingdoms and Anglo-Saxon England during this period involved complex relationships that included warfare, diplomacy, intermarriage, and cultural exchange. The expansion of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms like Mercia and Wessex created pressure on Welsh and Scottish territories, but Celtic kingdoms proved remarkably resilient in maintaining their independence while selectively adopting useful innovations from their Anglo-Saxon neighbors. The construction of Offa's Dyke in the late 8th century marked the formal recognition of the boundary between Anglo-Saxon England and Welsh kingdoms, but archaeological evidence suggests that this frontier remained permeable, with extensive trade and cultural exchange continuing across political boundaries. Welsh kingdoms maintained their independence while engaging in diplomatic relationships with Anglo-Saxon rulers that involved tribute payments, military alliances, and marriage connections that created complex networks of political obligation and cultural influence. The Viking raids that began in the late 8th century created new challenges for Celtic kingdoms, but also provided opportunities for political and military innovation. The attack on Iona in 795 CE marked the beginning of sustained Viking pressure on Celtic territories. But Celtic responses demonstrated remarkable adaptability and resilience. Irish kingdoms developed new military technologies and tactics while maintaining their cultural traditions and Christian faith, despite the disruption caused by pagan raiders. The establishment of Viking trading posts and settlements across Celtic territories paradoxically catalyzed a period of unprecedented political consolidation and cultural flowering that would define the medieval Celtic world. While Viking longships brought destruction to monasteries like Iona and Clonmacnoise, they also introduced new trade networks, military technologies, and urban concepts that ambitious Celtic rulers would adapt to create more centralized kingdoms capable of both resisting foreign invasion and projecting power across wider territories than their predecessors had controlled. Kenneth MacAlpin's unification of the Picts and Scots around 843 CE represents the most successful example of this political transformation, creating the Kingdom of Scotland through a complex process that involved military conquest, diplomatic marriage alliances, and the strategic exploitation of Pictish succession disputes. Kenneth's achievement went far beyond mere territorial expansion, establishing a new form of Celtic kingship that combined traditional Scottish concepts of royal authority with Pictish administrative systems and Christian legitimization strategies, borrowed from Irish ecclesiastical traditions. The circumstances surrounding Kenneth's rise to power demonstrate the sophisticated political calculations that characterized 9th-century Celtic leadership. As King of Dalriada, Kenneth faced increasing pressure from Viking raids that had devastated his western territories while simultaneously recognizing opportunities created by the extinction of the main Pictish royal line following a series of devastating defeats by Viking forces. His claim to the Pictish throne through his mother's lineage reflected the matrilineal succession practices that had governed Pictish society for centuries. But his successful assertion of this claim required military campaigns that established Scottish dominance over the more numerous and wealthy Pictish population. Kenneth's establishment of his capital at Scone marked a deliberate break with traditional Scottish political centers in the west, positioning his new kingdom's ceremonial heart in the fertile lowlands that had formed the core of Pictish power. The famous Stone of Destiny, upon which Scottish kings would be crowned for centuries, symbolized this political synthesis by incorporating both Scottish and Pictish royal traditions into a single ceremony that legitimized the new dynasty's authority over both populations. Archaeological evidence from Scone reveals extensive construction projects during Kenneth's reign that created a royal complex capable of accommodating the administrative needs of a much larger and more complex kingdom than previous Celtic rulers had governed. The integration of Pictish and Scottish populations under Kenneth's rule required careful management of cultural differences and competing claims to land and authority. The Pictish system of provinces governed by more mayors provided an administrative framework that Kenneth adapted to Scottish needs, creating a hierarchy of regional governors who maintained local authority while acknowledging royal supremacy. This system enabled the new kingdom to govern diverse populations across vast territories, while preserving local customs and legal traditions that might otherwise have created sources of resistance to Scottish rule. Kenneth's successors built upon his achievements by expanding Scottish authority into previously independent territories and developing more sophisticated governmental institutions that could manage the complex challenges of ruling a multi-ethnic kingdom. Constantine I and Donald I consolidated Scottish control over former Pictish territories while beginning the process of extending Scottish influence into Lothian and the Borders, regions that had previously been controlled by Northumbrian Anglo-Saxon kings. These expansion efforts involved not only military campaigns, but also the establishment of new monasteries and administrative centers that projected Scottish cultural influence into newly conquered territories. The reign of Constantine II marked the full maturation of the Scottish kingdom as a major European power capable of conducting independent foreign policy and projecting military force across long distances. Constantine's victory over the Northumbrians at the Battle of Corbridge in 918 CE demonstrated Scottish military capabilities, while his subsequent alliance with Welsh and Irish rulers against Anglo-Saxon expansion created a Celtic confederation that temporarily checked English territorial ambitions. The battle itself showcased the evolution of Scottish military organization, with Constantine's forces combining traditional Celtic warrior tactics with innovations learned from Viking and Anglo-Saxon opponents. Scottish military development during this period involved the adoption of new weapons technologies and tactical formations that enhanced the effectiveness of traditional Celtic fighting methods. Archaeological evidence from Scottish sites reveals the increasing use of mail armor, steel weapons, and cavalry equipment that required substantial economic resources and specialized craftsmen to produce. The development of castle-building techniques, initially learned from Norman examples but adapted to Scottish conditions, provided Scottish rulers with defensive capabilities that enabled them to control larger territories with smaller garrisons while creating symbols of royal authority that dominated local landscapes. The cultural achievements of the Scottish kingdom during this period included the development of distinctive artistic traditions that synthesized Pictish, Scottish, and Christian influences into new forms of expression. The famous St. Andrew's sarcophagus, carved during the 8th or 9th century, demonstrates the sophisticated stone carving techniques that Scottish craftsmen developed by combining Pictish expertise in symbol stones with Christian iconographic programs and artistic motifs derived from manuscript illumination. The sarcophagus features complex hunting scenes, biblical narratives, and abstract patterns that required exceptional technical skill and cultural knowledge to execute. Manuscript production in Scottish monasteries reached new levels of sophistication during this period, with scriptoriums at St. Andrews, Dunkeld, and other centers producing illuminated texts that rivaled the finest Irish and English examples. The Book of Deer, created in the 10th century, contains some of the earliest examples of written Scottish Gaelic alongside Latin texts, demonstrating the development of vernacular literacy that would become crucial for Scottish cultural identity. The manuscript's marginal notes, added by later scribes, provide invaluable evidence for Scottish social organization, land tenure, and legal practices during the medieval period. Welsh political development during the 8th through 12th centuries followed different patterns than Scottish unification, with multiple kingdoms maintaining their independence while engaging in complex relationships of alliance and competition that prevented the emergence of unified Welsh rule until much later periods. The kingdoms of Gwynedd, Powys, Deford, and smaller principalities each developed distinctive political institutions and cultural traditions, while sharing common Welsh linguistic and legal heritage that distinguished them from their Anglo-Saxon and Norman neighbors. Rhodri Mar's reign in Gwynedd exemplified the achievements and limitations of medieval Welsh kingship, demonstrating both the potential for Welsh political unification and the structural obstacles that prevented its realization. Rhodri's military successes against Viking raiders earned him recognition throughout Celtic Europe, while his marriage alliances with ruling families in Powys and Ceredigion created a network of relationships that temporarily brought much of Wales under his influence. However, the traditional Welsh practice of dividing inheritance among all male heirs meant that Rhodri's achievements were fragmented among his sons, preventing the establishment of permanent unified rule. The legal innovations associated with Hywel Dda's reign in Deheubarth represent one of the most significant intellectual achievements of medieval Wales, creating a comprehensive legal code that preserved ancient Welsh customs while adapting them to contemporary political and social conditions. The laws of Hywel Dda, compiled through assemblies that brought together legal experts from throughout Wales, established standardized procedures for resolving disputes, regulating marriage and inheritance, and maintaining social order that would govern Welsh society for centuries. The sophistication of Hywel's legal code demonstrates the high level of intellectual development that characterized medieval Welsh culture, with detailed provisions covering everything from the compensation owed for different types of injuries to the rights and obligations of various social classes. The law's treatment of women's rights was remarkably progressive for medieval Europe, allowing women to initiate divorce proceedings, inherit property, and participate in legal proceedings in ways that were prohibited in most contemporary legal systems. The code's emphasis on compensation rather than punishment for most crimes reflected ancient Celtic legal traditions while incorporating Christian moral principles that emphasized reconciliation and social harmony. Welsh cultural achievements during this period included the development of sophisticated poetic traditions that preserved ancient Celtic literary forms while adapting them to Christian themes and contemporary political concerns. The court poets who served Welsh rulers created elaborate praise poems that celebrated royal achievements while maintaining complex metrical and linguistic patterns derived from pre-Christian bardic traditions. These poems, preserved in manuscripts like the Book of Taliesin and the Book of Aneurin, provide invaluable evidence for Welsh social organization, political relationships, and cultural values during the medieval period. The Mabinogion, the collection of Welsh prose tales that was compiled during this period, represents one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated literary achievements, preserving ancient Celtic mythological traditions while adapting them to contemporary audiences through complex narrative structures and psychological insights. The four branches of the Mabinogi, which form the core of the collection, demonstrate the survival of pre-Christian Celtic religious concepts within Christian literary frameworks, with tales of otherworldly journeys, magical transformations, and divine interventions that maintain their power to inspire and instruct medieval audiences. The literary sophistication of the Mabinogion reflects the high level of cultural development that characterized medieval Welsh courts, with professional storytellers maintaining oral traditions that were eventually committed to writing by monastic scribes. The tale's complex narrative structures, which often involve multiple time periods and interconnected character relationships, required audiences with considerable cultural knowledge and literary sophistication to fully appreciate their meanings. The preservation of these stories in written form enabled their transmission to later generations while maintaining the flexibility and adaptability that had characterized oral tradition. Irish political development during the 8th through 12th centuries involved the emergence of powerful provincial kingdoms that competed for recognition as High Kings of Ireland, while maintaining the traditional Irish emphasis on kinship-based political organization. The Uaineel dynasties in the north and the various southern kingdoms developed increasingly sophisticated governmental institutions, while preserving the cultural traditions and legal systems that distinguished Irish society from its neighbors. Brian Bruce Rayner's High King represented the closest approach to unified Irish rule during the medieval period, demonstrating both the potential for Irish political consolidation and the cultural factors that prevented its permanent achievement. Brian's military victories over Viking forces and rival Irish kingdoms established his authority throughout most of Ireland, while his patronage of churches and schools created a cultural renaissance that produced some of medieval Ireland's finest artistic and literary achievements. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014 CE marked both the zenith and the end of Brian Bruce's achievements, with his victory over a coalition of Viking and Irish forces securing Irish independence from foreign domination, while his death in the battle eliminated the personal authority that had held his coalition together. The battle itself demonstrated the evolution of Irish military organization, with Brian's forces combining traditional Irish fighting methods with innovations learned from Viking opponents and continental European military developments. Irish cultural achievements during Brian Bruce reign included the production of some of medieval Europe's finest illuminated manuscripts, metalwork and stone carving that synthesized traditional Irish artistic motifs, with influences derived from Viking, Anglo-Saxon, and continental European sources. The Cross of Cong, created to house a relic of the true cross, demonstrates the sophisticated metalworking techniques that Irish craftsmen had developed by combining traditional Celtic methods with new technologies and decorative motifs learned through expanded trade contacts. The development of Irish historical writing during this period produced chronicles and genealogies that preserved ancient Irish traditions while adapting them to contemporary political needs. The Annals of Ulster, the Annals of the Four Masters, and other historical compilations created comprehensive records of Irish political development that enabled later generations to understand their cultural heritage, while providing contemporary rulers with legitimizing narratives that supported their political claims. The interactions between Celtic kingdoms and Viking settlers during this period created complex relationships that involved warfare, trade, intermarriage, and cultural exchange that transformed both Celtic and Scandinavian societies. The establishment of Viking towns like Dublin, Cork, Waterford, and Limerick introduced urban concepts to Ireland while creating new centers for trade and craft production that enhanced Irish economic development. These Viking settlements became integrated into Irish political systems through marriage alliances and military partnerships that created hybrid cultures combining Celtic and Scandinavian elements. The cultural exchange between Celtic and Viking populations produced distinctive artistic traditions that combined Scandinavian decorative motifs with Celtic technical expertise and Christian symbolic programs. The earnest style of decoration, which emerged from this cultural synthesis, influenced artistic production throughout Northern Europe while creating distinctively Irish and Scottish variants that reflected local preferences and technical traditions. Archaeological evidence from sites like Dublin's Wood Quay reveals the extent of this cultural interaction, with artifacts displaying complex combinations of Celtic, Viking, and Christian influences. The Arthurian literary tradition that emerged during this period represents one of medieval Europe's most influential cultural developments, transforming ancient Celtic heroic traditions into sophisticated literary works that would influence European culture for centuries. The historical Arthur, if he existed, was likely a post-Roman British war leader who organized Celtic resistance to Anglo-Saxon expansion, but the literary Arthur became a symbol of idealized kingship that incorporated Celtic concepts of sacred authority with Christian moral principles and chivalric values derived from continental European traditions. The development of Arthurian literature involved the gradual transformation of Welsh and Breton oral traditions into written works that adapted Celtic mythological themes to contemporary audiences throughout medieval Europe. Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, completed around 1136 CE, provided the foundation for later Arthurian literature by creating a comprehensive narrative framework that combined historical chronicles with legendary materials derived from Celtic sources. Geoffrey's work demonstrated the continuing influence of Celtic cultural traditions on medieval European literature, while adapting these traditions to contemporary political and religious concerns. The Celtic artistic renaissance that accompanied these political and literary developments produced some of medieval Europe's finest achievements in manuscript illumination, metalwork, and stone carving. The Book of Kells, completed during this period, represents the culmination of Celtic manuscript art with its complex geometric patterns, zoomorphic decorations, and innovative use of color that required exceptional technical skill and cultural knowledge to achieve. The manuscript's artistic program combines Christian iconography with traditional Celtic decorative motifs in ways that created entirely new forms of visual expression. Celtic metalworking during this period achieved unprecedented levels of sophistication, with craftsmen producing elaborate reliquaries, crosses, and secular objects that demonstrated mastery of complex techniques, including filigree work, crescent enameling, and repoussé decoration. The Ardak chalice, created in 8th century Ireland, exemplifies this technical achievement with its combination of silver, gold, bronze, and enamel work that required collaboration among specialists in metalworking techniques. The chalice's decorative program incorporates both Christian symbols and traditional Celtic motifs in a synthesis that reflects the cultural complexity of medieval Celtic society. The stone crosses that were erected throughout Celtic territories during this period created a distinctive architectural tradition that combined Christian symbolism with Celtic artistic expertise and social functions. These crosses, which often stood over 20 feet tall and featured elaborate carved decoration, served as focal points for religious ceremonies while displaying the wealth and cultural sophistication of their patrons. The crosses at Clonmacnoise, Monasterbies, and other Irish sites demonstrate the evolution of stone carving techniques that enabled Celtic craftsmen to create increasingly complex decorative programs that told biblical stories while incorporating traditional Celtic artistic motifs. The sophisticated cultural achievements of medieval Celtic kingdoms faced their greatest existential threat not from Viking raiders or Anglo-Saxon expansion, but from the systematic military campaigns launched by Norman-descended rulers who possessed both the technological advantages of continental European warfare and the administrative expertise necessary to transform military conquest into permanent political control. The Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169, initiated by the exiled king of Leinster Diarmait Macmercator's appeal for foreign assistance, marked the beginning of a centuries-long process that would fundamentally alter the political landscape of Celtic Europe while simultaneously creating the conditions that would preserve and transform Celtic cultural identity in unexpected ways. The Norman invasion force that landed at Bannow Bay in County Wexford consisted of approximately 600 heavily armed knights and men-at-arms equipped with the latest military technology, including crossbows, siege engines, and most importantly heavily armored cavalry that could dominate traditional Celtic infantry formations in open battle. The Norman military system, perfected through decades of conquest in England and continental Europe, emphasized coordinated tactical operations supported by sophisticated logistics networks and engineering capabilities that enabled rapid construction of fortifications to consolidate territorial gains. The initial Norman victories at Wexford and Waterford demonstrated the tactical superiority of disciplined cavalry charges against traditional Celtic military formations, but the long-term success of the invasion depended upon the ability of the Norman to adapt their continental European governmental systems to Irish conditions while co-opting existing Irish political structures. The marriage of the Norman leader Strongbow to Diermat's daughter Aoife symbolized this strategy of integration, creating legal claims to Irish territories that could be justified under both Norman and Irish law, while establishing personal relationships that facilitated cultural exchange between the two populations. The construction of Norman castles throughout the conquered territories represented a revolutionary transformation in Irish military architecture, with stone fortifications like Kilkenny Castle and Trim Castle providing defensive capabilities that far exceeded traditional Irish ring forts while serving as administrative centers for Norman colonial government. These castles, typically built on elevated sites that commanded strategic river crossings or road junctions, created networks of fortified positions that enabled relatively small Norman garrisons to control extensive territories while projecting military power across previously independent Irish kingdoms. However, the Norman conquest of Ireland proved far less complete than their earlier success in England, with large areas of the island remaining under Irish control. While many Norman settlers gradually adopted Irish customs, language, and legal practices in a process that contemporary observers described as becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves. The Statute of Kilkenny, enacted in 1366, represented English attempts to prevent this cultural assimilation by prohibiting Norman settlers from adopting Irish dress, language, or marriage customs, but the legislation's very existence demonstrated the extent to which cultural fusion had already occurred. The English conquest of Wales followed different patterns, but achieved more systematic results, with Edward the Sare's campaigns between 1277 and 1283 establishing direct English control over the Principality of Gwynedd while reducing other Welsh kingdoms to tributary status. The construction of massive stone castles at Cernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, and Beaumaris created an integrated defensive system that could be supplied by sea while dominating the terrain that had previously provided Welsh forces with tactical advantages against English armies. Edward the Sare's castle-building program in Wales represented one of medieval Europe's most ambitious military engineering projects, with the fortifications designed not merely to control territory, but to serve as symbols of English authority that would overawe Welsh populations, while providing secure bases for English administration. The castle at Cernarfon, built to echo the walls of Constantinople and deliberately constructed on the site of the Roman fort of Saguntium, demonstrated English intentions to present their conquest as the restoration of imperial authority rather than mere foreign domination. The systematic nature of English conquest in Wales extended beyond military occupation to include comprehensive legal and administrative reforms that replaced traditional Welsh law with English legal systems while eliminating the political autonomy that Welsh kingdoms had maintained for centuries. The Statute of Rhuddlan in 1284 formally incorporated Wales into the English legal system while establishing administrative structures that would govern Welsh territories as integral parts of the English kingdom rather than as conquered foreign territories. Despite these political transformations, Welsh cultural identity proved remarkably resilient, with the Welsh language, literary traditions, and social customs surviving under English rule while adapting to new political circumstances. The bardic tradition that had served Welsh courts for centuries continued to flourish under English rule, with poets like Dafydd ap Gwilym creating sophisticated works that maintained traditional Welsh poetic forms, while incorporating influences from continental European literature and contemporary political developments. The gradual integration of Scotland into the English political system followed more complex patterns that involved both military conquest and diplomatic negotiation, with the Wars of Scottish Independence demonstrating both the vulnerability of Scottish political institutions to English pressure and the remarkable capacity of Scottish society to resist foreign domination through sustained military campaigns supported by popular nationalism. The initial English success in subduing Scotland during the 1290s appeared to follow the same patterns that had proven effective in Wales, with English forces capturing major Scottish castles while installing English administrators to govern Scottish territories. However, the Scottish response to English occupation revealed the extent to which Scottish national identity had developed during the medieval period, with figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce mobilizing popular resistance that drew upon both traditional Scottish military capabilities and innovative tactical approaches adapted to contemporary warfare. The Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297 demonstrated Scottish tactical innovation under Wallace's leadership, with Scottish forces using their intimate knowledge of local terrain to trap English cavalry in marshy ground, where their technological advantages became liabilities. The victory provided Scottish resistance with crucial momentum while establishing tactical principles that would influence Scottish military doctrine for centuries, emphasizing mobility, terrain exploitation, and the coordination of different military units in complex operations. Robert the Bruce's subsequent campaigns established the strategic framework for Scottish independence through a combination of guerrilla warfare, diplomatic initiatives, and conventional military operations that gradually wore down English resolve while building Scottish institutional capacity. The Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, which asserted Scottish independence in terms that combined traditional Celtic concepts of popular sovereignty with contemporary European political theory, provided intellectual justification for Scottish resistance while appealing to broader European support for Scottish claims. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 marked the decisive Scottish victory that secured independence while demonstrating the evolution of Scottish military organization under Bruce's leadership. The Scottish forces, numbering approximately 7,000 men, utilized defensive positions that channeled English cavalry charges into prepared killing zones while coordinating infantry spearmen with cavalry units in tactical formations that maximized Scottish advantages while minimizing English strengths. The long-term consequences of these medieval conquests created political frameworks that would shape Celtic development for centuries, with Ireland remaining partially conquered, Wales fully incorporated into English administration, and Scotland maintaining independence while engaging in complex relationships with English power. These different outcomes reflected both the varying effectiveness of English military campaigns and the diverse responses of Celtic societies to foreign pressure, with some communities choosing accommodation while others organized sustained resistance. The decline of Celtic languages began during the medieval period, but accelerated dramatically during the early modern era as English and French administrative systems, commercial networks, and educational institutions gradually marginalized Celtic linguistic traditions. The replacement of Latin with vernacular languages in government and education initially benefited Celtic languages in some regions, but the increasing centralization of political authority and the growth of commercial economies favored languages that provided access to wider markets and administrative opportunities. In Ireland, the English-speaking population concentrated in the Pale around Dublin gradually expanded its influence through commercial and administrative advantages, while Irish remained the primary language of rural populations and traditional Irish social elites. The plantation policies initiated during the 16th and 17th centuries accelerated this linguistic transformation by introducing large numbers of English and Scottish settlers who established communities that maintained their linguistic traditions, while creating economic and social pressures that encouraged Irish populations to adopt English for practical purposes. The penal laws enacted against Irish Catholics during the 17th and 18th centuries created additional pressures for linguistic assimilation by restricting Irish access to education, land ownership, and professional opportunities while providing advantages to those who adopted English customs and Protestant religion. These policies, while primarily designed to maintain political control and religious conformity, had profound effects on Irish linguistic development by creating social hierarchies that associated English with advancement and opportunity, while relegating Irish to rural and traditional contexts. In Wales, the Act of Union in 1536 established English as the sole language of government and law, while prohibiting the use of Welsh in official contexts, creating systematic disadvantages for Welsh speakers in legal proceedings, administrative positions, and commercial transactions. The policy of excluding Welsh speakers from jury service and administrative positions created practical incentives for Welsh elites to adopt English while maintaining Welsh as a domestic and community language. The development of Welsh Protestant religious traditions during the 16th and 17th centuries provided crucial support for Welsh linguistic survival by creating religious contexts where Welsh remained the primary language of worship and religious instruction. The translation of the Bible into Welsh in 1588 by William Morgan established standardized Welsh orthography while providing Welsh speakers with access to religious texts in their native language, creating educational and cultural resources that supported linguistic maintenance. Scottish Gaelic faced similar pressures following the Union of the Crowns in 1603 and the subsequent political integration of Scotland into the British system, with English becoming the language of administration, education, and commercial advancement, while Gaelic remained primarily associated with Highland rural communities. The Jacobite uprisings of the 18th century created additional pressures on Gaelic culture by associating Highland traditions with political rebellion, leading to systematic efforts to suppress Gaelic language, dress, and cultural practices following the Battle of Culloden in 1746. The Highland clearances of the 18th and 19th centuries devastated Gaelic-speaking communities by forcing large populations to emigrate to North America and Australia, while replacing traditional clan-based social organization with commercial sheep farming that required fewer workers and provided little support for Gaelic cultural traditions. These demographic changes fundamentally altered the social context that had supported Gaelic language transmission, while creating diaspora communities that faced additional challenges in maintaining their linguistic heritage. The Celtic cultural revival that began during the 18th century represented a complex response to these pressures that combined Romantic nationalism with scholarly investigation of Celtic heritage, creating new forms of Celtic identity that drew upon historical traditions while adapting them to contemporary political and cultural circumstances. The Ossian poems published by James Macpherson in the 1760s, regardless of their controversial authenticity, demonstrated European fascination with Celtic literary traditions while providing inspiration for Romantic nationalism throughout Europe. The scholarly investigation of Celtic languages, and during the 18th and 19th centuries, established academic foundations for Celtic cultural revival by creating systematic studies of Celtic linguistic relationships, historical development, and literary traditions. The work of scholars like Edward Llwydd, who published the first comparative study of Celtic languages in 1707, provided scientific evidence for Celtic cultural unity while documenting the diversity of Celtic linguistic traditions across different regions and time periods. The establishment of Celtic studies as an academic discipline during the 19th century created institutional support for Celtic cultural preservation while training generations of scholars who would document, analyze, and promote Celtic heritage through universities, museums, and cultural organizations. The Royal Irish Academy, founded in 1785, and similar institutions in Wales and Scotland provided forums for Celtic scholarship while creating networks of scholars and cultural activists who collaborated in preserving and promoting Celtic traditions. The political dimensions of Celtic cultural revival became increasingly important during the 19th century as Celtic identity became associated with movements for political autonomy and cultural self-determination. The Irish cultural revival, led by figures like Douglas Hyde and the Gaelic League, emphasized the connection between Irish language preservation and Irish political independence, creating cultural programs that supported both linguistic revival and nationalist political movements. The Welsh cultural revival centered on the Eisteddfod fad tradition, which was revived and systematized during the 19th century to create competitive festivals that celebrated Welsh language, literature, and musical traditions, while providing venues for cultural education and community building. The National Eisteddfod of established in its modern form during the 1860s, became a crucial institution for Welsh cultural preservation, while demonstrating the continuing vitality of Welsh artistic traditions. Scottish cultural revival took different forms in Highland and Lowland regions, with Highland revival emphasizing Gaelic language and traditional clan culture, while Lowland revival focused on Scots language and border traditions. The romanticization of Highland culture following the Jacobite defeats created complex relationships between authentic cultural preservation and invented traditions that served contemporary political and cultural needs while sometimes obscuring historical realities. The global spread of Celtic cultural influence during the 19th and 20th centuries occurred primarily through emigration from Celtic regions to North America, Australia, and other destinations where Celtic immigrants established communities that maintained their cultural traditions while adapting them to new environments. Irish emigration to the United States created large Irish American communities that preserved certain aspects of Irish culture while developing distinctive Irish American traditions that influenced American political and cultural development. The Irish potato famine of the 1840s created massive emigration that established Irish communities throughout the English-speaking world, while creating diaspora networks that maintained connections with Ireland and supported Irish political movements. These emigrant communities often preserved cultural traditions that were disappearing in Ireland while developing new forms of Irish identity that emphasized historical grievances and cultural distinctiveness. Welsh emigration to Pennsylvania, Ohio, and other American destinations created Welsh American communities that maintained Welsh language and religious traditions while adapting to American political and economic conditions. The Welsh settlements in Patagonia, established during the 1860s, represented the most systematic attempt to create Welsh-speaking communities outside Wales while maintaining direct connections with Welsh cultural institutions. Scottish emigration created Highland communities throughout North America that preserved Gaelic language and cultural traditions while developing distinctive Scottish American and Scottish Canadian identities. The Highland Games tradition, which became popular in North American Scottish communities, combined authentic Scottish athletic competitions with invented traditions that served contemporary community-building needs while maintaining connections to Scottish heritage. The 20th century witnessed both continued decline and remarkable revival of Celtic languages and cultures, with political developments creating new opportunities for Celtic cultural expression, while modern communications technology enabled global networks of Celtic cultural enthusiasts. The establishment of independent Ireland in 1922 created the first modern Celtic nation-state, while providing institutional support for Irish language revival and cultural preservation. The Irish language revival movement achieved mixed results, with Irish becoming an official language of the Irish state while failing to achieve widespread popular usage outside of designated Gaeltacht regions. The development of Irish language education, media, and cultural institutions created infrastructure for language maintenance, while political support ensured continued government funding for Irish language programs. Welsh language revival achieved greater success during the late 20th century through political campaigns that secured official status for Welsh, while creating Welsh language education systems and media outlets that served growing numbers of Welsh speakers. The establishment of S4C, the Welsh language television channel, in 1982 provided crucial media support for Welsh language maintenance, while creating new opportunities for Welsh cultural expression. Scottish Gaelic revival faced greater challenges due to the smaller number of speakers and the geographic concentration of Gaelic-speaking communities in remote areas, but political devolution in Scotland created new opportunities for Gaelic cultural support, while European Union policies supporting minority languages provided additional resources for Gaelic preservation programs. The development of Celtic music as a global phenomenon during the late 20th century demonstrated the continuing appeal of Celtic cultural traditions, while creating new forms of Celtic identity that transcended national boundaries. Irish traditional music, popularized by groups like the Chieftains and later Riverdance, became internationally recognized while influencing popular music development throughout the world. The commercial success of Celtic music created economic incentives for cultural preservation, while sometimes simplifying complex cultural traditions for mass consumption. The global popularity of Celtic festivals, Celtic spirituality, and Celtic artistic traditions demonstrated the continuing resonance of Celtic cultural themes, while creating new contexts for Celtic identity that extended far beyond traditional Celtic regions. Contemporary Celtic identity in the 21st century reflects both the persistence of historical traditions and the adaptation of Celtic culture to modern circumstances, with Celtic communities maintaining their distinctive characteristics while participating fully in contemporary European and global societies. The political autonomy movements in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have achieved varying degrees of success, while demonstrating the continuing relevance of Celtic political traditions in contemporary democratic contexts. The Scottish independence referendum of 2014, though unsuccessful, demonstrated the vitality of Scottish national identity while creating new discussions about the relationship between cultural identity and political sovereignty. The Brexit referendum and its aftermath have created new dynamics in Celtic political development, with Scotland and Northern Ireland voting to remain in the European Union, while England and Wales voted to leave, creating potential constitutional crises that may reshape the United Kingdom's political structure. Welsh devolution has created new institutions for Welsh self-government, while supporting Welsh language revival and cultural preservation through educational policies and media development. The success of Welsh medium education in creating new generations of Welsh speakers demonstrates the potential for minority language revival under supportive political conditions. Northern Ireland's peace process has created new opportunities for Irish cultural expression, while maintaining complex relationships between Irish and British identities that reflect the region's complicated political heritage. The Good Friday Agreement's recognition of both Irish and British identities provides frameworks for cultural diversity while supporting peaceful coexistence between different communities. The global Celtic diaspora continues to maintain connections with Celtic heritage through cultural festivals, genealogical research, and cultural tourism that support Celtic cultural preservation, while creating international networks of Celtic cultural enthusiasts. The development of online communities and digital resources has enabled global participation in Celtic cultural activities, while providing new platforms for Celtic language learning and cultural exchange. The academic study of Celtic culture has expanded significantly during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, with Celtic studies programs in universities throughout the world providing scholarly support for Celtic cultural preservation, while training new generations of Celtic scholars and cultural activists. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal new aspects of ancient Celtic civilization, while genetic research provides insights into Celtic population history and migration patterns. The legacy of Celtic civilization extends far beyond the specific communities that maintain Celtic languages and cultural traditions, with Celtic contributions to European art, literature, law, and political thought continuing to influence contemporary culture throughout the world. The Celtic emphasis on individual dignity, community responsibility, and harmony with the natural world provides valuable perspectives on contemporary social and environmental challenges, while demonstrating the continuing relevance of ancient wisdom in modern contexts. The preservation and revival of Celtic languages represents one of the most significant achievements of contemporary Celtic communities, with dedicated efforts by educators, activists, and cultural organizations creating new opportunities for Celtic language transmission, while adapting ancient languages to contemporary communication needs. The development of Celtic media, education systems, and cultural institutions demonstrates the possibility of minority language survival in the modern world, while providing models for other endangered language communities. The story of Celtic civilization, from its origins in prehistoric Central Europe to its contemporary global manifestations, illustrates both the resilience of human culture and the complex processes through which cultural traditions adapt to changing historical circumstances. The CELTS journey from Iron Age warriors to modern European citizens demonstrates the capacity of human communities to maintain their distinctive identities while participating fully in broader civilizational developments, creating legacies that continue to enrich human culture and provide inspiration for future generations seeking to balance tradition with innovation in an increasingly interconnected world. Thank you for listening to the whole story. If you like my channel, like and subscribe.